This is the Prince's Highway. Its 2,000-kilometre length runs from Sydney to Port Augusta in South Australia. It is a long but scenic route that on the 4th of September 2005 became the scene of one of the most appalling crimes Australia had ever witnessed. The actions of one man that night would destroy a family.
I don't wish death on him because I want him to suffer.
Where are the kids? They're in the water. Hey?
A 3-month police investigation would point to the unthinkable.
The facts at the time were a vehicle had left the roadway, travelled across the embankment, through a fence and into the dam.
We set up lighting and we didn't find any marks, and that concerned me greatly.
Detectives and the public were faced with a stark choice. Was it an accident or something worse?
And I don't think after you listen to Farquharson you can come to too many other conclusions other than he killed his kids.
The murders committed by Robert Farquharson were crimes that shook Australia. On the evening of Father's Day, September 2005, a car was driving along this highway. Inside were a father and his 3 sons. Suddenly, it veered off the road and into a dam. The aftermath of that tragic event would stun the nation and leave the family devastated.
When you lose a child, let alone 3, you die yourself. I found that I died with my children and I haven't had a life since.
It's really affected my life greatly. Hugely. And it's destroyed her. Totally.
It's the cruelest thing to have to live with. Knowing that you were this person 10 years ago. You're a totally different person.
About an hour's drive west of the city of Melbourne lies the rural township of Winchelsea. With a population of around 1,500, the peaceful community would, in 2005, be thrust unwillingly into the media spotlight.
I think Winchelsea's an interesting place. It's your typical semi-rural, rural community. It's a place where people tend to be born there and stay there, and they go to school there, they marry people that they know from the local area, and they tend to live in the area where they were born and not move far away.
Cindy Gambino had known Robert Farquharson since they were teenagers. After her previous boyfriend was tragically killed, what started as a friendship developed into a romance, with Cindy initially attracted to the well-liked Robbie Farquharson. It was an attraction that wouldn't last.
Cindy and Robert met when she was a youngster. Robert was a local lad that she knew from around the traps. Everybody knew little Robbie Farquharson. And he was one of those guys in the group. He was not seen as a particular love interest on Cindy's part.
There was no real physical attraction there. And that's how I knew I'd settled for second best. But there was security there.
He was just solid, reliable Robbie that was always around, offering her lifts, giving her a lift home from the pub, giving her a lift from the local disco. He was Mr. Solid, Mr. Reliable that was never going to want to move away from Winchelsea, which suited her fine.
There's the belly there.
I fell pregnant 6 months into the relationship, and that's when things started going downhill.
The belly.
The baby.
And Rob was like a big mummy's boy. He'd stayed at home a lot longer than his friends. When he found Cindy, she already had somewhere to live. She was already independent. And he sort of sees that strength in her, you know, that she can look after him. And he sort of treated her like his mum.
There was a lot of things that he wouldn't do. I remember the first time I went shopping on my own and left Jay with him, and Jay was just a new baby. and come home and Jay was in a dirty nappy and he wouldn't change the nappy. Never ever got up during the night to the children. It was always me.
She and Rob had been together, I think, for about 6 years then, when they decided to tie the knot. Even on her wedding day, when people were fussing around her, saying, you know, smile, this is fantastic, this is such a big day for you, she was having second thoughts.
Robert and Cindy were married in the year 2000. By then, they had 2 children, Jay and Tyler, and were joined 2 years later by their third child, Bailey. Even in the early stages of the marriage, flaws in Robert's character were beginning to emerge.
I think he was dissatisfied with his life. I think he was resentful that he had to go to work, he had to get a second job. But I think he was quietly angry with Cindy too, because she was a very strong woman, and it was that strength that he resented.
The financial pressure that Farquharson found himself under inevitably took its toll on family life.
He was actually very angry, and he would rile the kids, he would rouse the kids up. It was passive-aggressive behaviour where he would wind them up to the point that Jay, the older one, would sit and cry. He would do that until they burst into tears, and then the little boy would go in his room and slam the door.
He would stir them up till they got to a point where they were so angry with him that they had no respect for him whatsoever.
That's actually sadistic and it's quite cruel. He sort of was wearing his own anger out, projecting his own anger onto everyone around him.
With Robert increasingly disenchanted with his job and family life, his marriage to Cindy began to disintegrate. In May 2004, Cindy met single father Stephen Mools, a local contractor who was working on their property. Stephen himself had only recently come out of a traumatic breakup, and he now found himself in the middle of another one.
Cindy and Robert's relationship was sinking. When Stephen came on the scene, I think he became a bit of a confidant, where she would say, you know, I'm not really that happy, what do you think? And he didn't really want to get involved in that.
And she made it very clear that, you know, she thought something of me. I said, well, I'm sorry, but you're married, and I've just come out of a very ugly relationship. It's just not happening. Eventually, I became aware that they were separating. Rob would come around to my house nearly every night, and I was trying to counsel him.
I guess as a single dad of 2 boys himself, doing it hard for Stephen, it was very frustrating and irritating to watch Robert grizzling and moaning and doing nothing to move forward.
After, it was a good couple of months, I got to the point where I went, you know what? You're an idiot. You don't want your wife back.
Stephen actually had quite a scene with him where Stephen was saying, you know, pull your socks up. You're not a father. You're not even being a father. You know, you're like being a big baby. Grow up and act like a father. I'm not trying to take your place. I don't want to be you. I've got my own children. But if you want to be a father, start behaving like one. So it was quite a sort of toxic triangle that he really didn't want to be involved in.
Cindy asked Robert to leave their home in November 2004, sure that their marriage was over.
He always said to me when we had a third child, oh, this is going to wreck our marriage, and I couldn't work out why a third child would wreck our marriage. And it wasn't the third child that wrecked our marriage, it was him. All I wanted to do was be married and have children, but I just married the wrong person.
While she began a new chapter in her life, Robert struggled to cope with the breakdown of the relationship.
He was saying that they'd separated, but it was a mutual thing, that they had separated on good terms and that he was moving on in his life. That wasn't actually true at all. That was completely untrue. He was very angry. He was stalking Cindy.
He was always looking for where my car was and who I was with. It was not a nice feeling.
Well, we'd see his car go past overnight, and then he'd obviously go around the block, and then all of a sudden we'd see it again and be like, what is this guy doing? It was behaviour that was consistent with someone who had obsessive, maybe even possessive thoughts. And I remember I used to say to Cindy, you know, is he all together?
There was a moment a few days before. It was a Wednesday night and he rang me and he wasn't doing very well. He was really depressed. And I spoke to Stephen's mother about it and she said, just watch out. That pricked my ears up. But I thought he was suicidal, not homicidal.
However increasingly bizarre and disturbing Robert's behaviour was becoming, it always seemed to be directed towards Cindy. And so, when Father's Day 2005 came round, there was never any suggestion that his children would be in any sort of danger.
After I said goodbye to the kids and drove off, I didn't think that was going to be the last time I'd ever see my kids.
Cindy and Robert Farquharson split up in late 2004. As divorce proceedings began, the pair tried to ensure the breakdown of the family had as little effect as possible on their 3 children, Jay, Tyler and Bailey.
Jay absolutely loved football. He had a dry sense of humour. He was a good kid, very responsible.
Jay was an extremely intelligent little boy, very focused on where he wanted to head in life, wanted to be a fireman.
Tyler was Mum's boy. He would come up and just turn the vacuum cleaner off and I just want to give you a hug, Mum.
I could see, by the way he was towards me, that there was something missing from Dad.
Could you take a picture?
There was definitely something missing from Dad, whether it was cuddles, whether it was bedtime stories, combination of all of the above, I don't know, but there was something missing.
What about the muscle man?
Bailey, on the other hand,
Bailey, no.
he was just a really magnetic little boy.
Yay!
He took to me like a duck does to water.
He loved Stephen to bits. He just didn't have a chance.
Father's Day in 2005 began like any normal day.
The whole day started so well. Cindy spent the morning with her own father, took her children to see her own dad, and then she took the children to Rob.
I'd had a photo of the 3 boys blown up for him for when he got home.
She was making their beds, getting their school lunches ready, getting their bags and their uniforms ready for the next day, and the clock's ticking, and where are they?
Next thing I hear a car pull up, which sounded exactly like his car. I thought, oh, here they are now. And it was him. He lobbed on my doorstep and said, I've killed the kids.
So what do you mean, where are the kids? Why are you here? Why did you leave them? Where are they? Stephen was at his house and she telephoned him straight away and said, there's been an accident, the kids are in the water. None of it was making any sense.
I got a phone call and my cousin, Aaron, actually answered it. And he held the phone away from his ear and went, I think it's Cindy, Steve, and she's screaming. Handed me the phone. I held the phone and she's screaming, the kids are in the water, the kids are in the water. I'm going, what kids?
Cindy jumped in her car with Robert and headed out into the night, still unaware of exactly what had happened to her 3 children. The only thing she could determine was that Robert's car had crashed into a dam on the outskirts of town. While Robert had escaped the vehicle, her 3 sons were trapped inside. Unbeknownst to her, the car had by that point already been underwater for almost 30 minutes.
All I do remember is turning onto the highway, and by the time I'd hit the roadhouse, I was doing 145 clicks. Oh, I just remember saying I had to get to my kids.
It was 7:45 when they arrived at the dam, followed minutes later by Stephen. Still, no one was aware of the terrible fate that had befallen the 3 children.
Cindy's car's parked there. Rob's car's nowhere in sight. Cindy was hysterical, just running up and down, up and down, up and down. What's going on? You know, where are the kids? They're in the water. Instantly, from the second of seeing him, you got to smoke. I said, what? My initial thought is, hang on. You're telling me your kids are in the water? You're asking me for a smoke. There's something not right about you.
Where are the kids?
I said, get out of my face or I'll fucking kill you. I jumped in the water and I'm trying all these different spots and, yeah, obviously to no avail. We wouldn't be sitting here today. Yeah, it was only shortly after that that the services arrived. They started unloading ropes and this and that, and as soon as I saw a rope, I went, yep. And I grabbed a rope and started tying around my waist, and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going back in. At least I got a rope this time. No, you don't know.
Well, I was the first ambulance to arrive on the scene. I was actually pointed out to Robert Farquharson. I found out that he'd been the driver of the vehicle, and at that time there was 3 kids trapped in the car in the dam.
I remember glancing up. I glanced up a few times actually to see where he was, and I remember he was up at Cindy's car. Had his legs slightly spread and his arms folded, just looking. And not even comforting Cindy. I remember saying that to myself as well. Not even comforting Cindy. Cindy was hysterical, absolutely beside herself.
His demeanour was a bit odd, I found. Like the time I had with him, he never asked about the kids. He said he'd been driving along Princess Highway. He had this coughing fit, which caused him to black out and career across the road and go into the dam.
During the questioning, he turned around and said, no, I had a coughing fit. Now, at that stage, it got every alarm bell that I had going. People can have coughing fits and black out, but basically it's associated with quite often a heavy smoker who's got a disease process very similar to asthma. Now, it's something that when started doesn't disappear in 5 seconds or 5 minutes. It is something that when you look for and listen for, you'd have signs and symptoms to support what he stated. There was nothing I could find to support what he said.
Meanwhile, officers from the Victoria Police Major Collision Investigation Unit had arrived at the dam, and their years of experience investigating incidents on the roads was telling them something was amiss at the scene.
Where motor cars run off the road, then the driver panics and he oversteers the car, they lose control and see those marks regularly on our roads. So initially I thought that that's probably what would have happened, so we're going to set up a lighting system back. In the end, we went back nearly 1 kilometre along the road. We set up lighting and we didn't find any marks, and that concerned me greatly.
As police conducted their investigation at the scene, Farquharson was taken to a local hospital for a medical examination. Shortly afterwards, he was joined there by detectives determined to find out what had happened from the sole witness to the incident.
I expected to see someone pretty bedraggled and scared and upset, but he was fairly calm. At that stage, I cautioned him. He sort of acknowledged that, and then he just went on. He told a story about how he turned on the heater, and the heater had started to make him want to cough. And he started to cough, and the next thing he realised, he'd crashed his car. The car rapidly sank. The kids didn't get out of the car, and he tried to get the kids out of the car by diving under the water. Now, at that stage, we really started to have our doubts about him because he just didn't look like a bloke who'd been diving under the water.
Back at the scene, any hopes of a rescue operation had long since faded. At 12:40 a.m, some 5 hours after the car had plunged into the dam, the vehicle was found by a police diver. In it lay the 3 bodies of Jay, Tyler and Bailey.
The vehicle was actually vertical, nose down into the mud. The driver's side door was open and the eldest boy, Jay, his upper body was out onto the driver's side door. So he'd nearly got completely out of the motor car, which was, upsetting for, I think, everybody there. So we winched the car out of the water. Of course, a huge amount of water ran out. The very first thing I saw was the ignition switch. Now, I thought it was very unusual that a person would, in the dark, have a coughing fit, drive out onto a dam and turn the ignition key off. And of course the headlight switch was turned off. So why you turned the headlight switch off sort of astounded me also. So the gear shift wasn't in the overdrive position, it was in the direct drive position. And it was a cool, cold night and the fan wasn't turned on. So for a person that was having a coughing fit, had a cold, not to have the heater on, I thought was really strange too. So a lot of factors in the car that, and the 3 boys, of course, they were all out of their seatbelts, and that was very disturbing to think that they'd got so close and just didn't make it.
Whilst the evidence from the car and the scene was pointing to foul play, Farquharson's behaviour at the hospital was fueling detective suspicions.
At the completion of the interview, I had no doubt that something was terribly wrong. He only asked 2 questions, really. He said, I haven't been in a lot of trouble. I haven't been in a lot of trouble. What's the scenario for me from here? And the other one was, what's going to happen to me? I was gobsmacked because they're not the sort of questions you'd be asking. What are happening with the kids? They sort of cling on to hope and stuff like that, and they say, is there any chance that one of them might be all right? But he never did.
By now, Cindy had been taken to hospital in Winchelsea, suffering from severe shock. The grim task of identifying her children fell to Stephen.
Jay was in a body bag on the ground, and I had a little word to Jay. Said a prayer. I remember saying to the coroner after that, I walked back over to the coroner and I said, this is shit. I said, he said, yeah, it's in all the 30 odd years or something that I've been doing this job, I've never ever seen or been to anything as bad. I said, Tyler and Bailey are in the car, am I allowed to touch them? He said, no. Oh, okay. And with that, I walked over to the car. I knew Bailey was gone, obviously, but I whispered in his ear, you'll be safe.
I left the hospital and had a quick conversation with Jeff Exton. I said to him, something's dreadfully wrong here. And before I could more or less finish telling him what I thought was wrong with Mr. Farquharson, Jeff had said to me, he said, it's no good down here. He said, if he's saying that's what happened, that didn't happen. He said, there's something horribly wrong here.
In September 2005, Victoria Police were investigating the deaths of 3 young children when their father's car crashed into a dam and sank. Ordinarily, in a homicide investigation, police will have a crime and try to identify a suspect. In this case, they knew something had happened, they just didn't know if it was a crime.
The facts at the time were a vehicle had left the roadway, travelled across the embankment, through a fence and into the dam. The driver had got out, flagged down a car and gone back into town to raise the alarm, where he didn't partake in any of the rescue effort. And as detectives, that sort of raised some flags in their own mind as to, are we dealing with a tragic accident, or is there something more that needs to be further investigated?
I made a list, and on the top of the list I put he did it or he didn't do it. And on the left-hand side of the list I had a whole list of things that I wrote down which pointed towards him doing a deliberate act. And they were all along the lines of his demeanour, his dodgy story. Just the crash couldn't have happened the way he said it happened. The fact that the car was still under acceleration as it went into the dam. The fact that when I'd gotten into the car and he told me that he'd turned the heater on. Well, the heater was off. The lights weren't on, he'd turned the lights off and the ignition was off. The way that he wanted to be taken back to confront Cindy and tell her himself that the kids had been killed. And then I started in the he didn't do it. And I was really hard pressed, and the only thing I could come up with on the he didn't do it side was, who could be this evil?
Whilst the police carried on with their grim task, the family faced their own torment, the funeral of the 3 boys.
The children were buried in Winchelsea Cemetery. Cindy had booked a burial plot for herself to be buried next to her children one day. Unbeknown to Cindy, when they booked the burial plots, Robert had booked a burial plot for himself next to the children and next to the wife that didn't want him anymore. It's the ultimate sick joke, I think, that he would be reunited with Cindy one way or the other.
The true nature of Robert Farquharson was perfectly captured by a photographer at the funeral.
There was a photograph of herself with Robert at the funeral, where they were clutching each other, they're propping each other up. With hindsight, that is sick too. Here she is being propped up by the man who's caused her all this pain.
The following week saw Robert Farquharson interviewed by police, and he stuck to his story about a coughing fit causing him to black out. However, the evidence that was being fed back to detectives from the dam was telling a different story.
There were at least 3 steering inputs to get that vehicle from the road to the dam. The first steering input is to turn off the roadway itself. They found no marks on the road to indicate a vehicle had lost control, no skid marks, scuff marks. The second steering input is to straighten the front tyres up again to follow a straight path. And then the third steering input is to miss the tree. It's veered to the right just before it went into the dam to avoid the tree that was there.
If there was 3 steering inputs into the motor car and it's been accelerated across there, clearly Mr Farquharson's not having a coughing fit, clearly Mr Farquharson's not unconscious, and clearly he deliberately drove the motor car into the dam.
As well as the forensic work being carried out, detectives were trying to determine if Farquharson's actions in the weeks and months leading up to Father's Day could reveal any clues as to what would happen that night.
Found a focus for his anger, I think, in the material possessions, and the focus was on what he referred to as the shit car, that Cindy had even taken the best car and left him with the shit family car. And it seemed to him, though, that the division of the family finances was completely unfair. He was a known whinger, a known moaner, who said all sorts of outrageous things. So there were a few veiled threats to Cindy. I think Cindy, having lived with Rob all those years and listened to all that sort of stuff, thought it was just more of the same. She was concerned he was depressed, but she never dreamed for a moment that he was considering harming the children. And of course she was completely unaware of the conversation that he'd had with Gregory King outside the fish and chip shop 3 months before.
Greg parked his car and Farquharson pulled up next to him or near him in his own car, and they were just talking.
He'd got this festering anger towards Cindy over driving around in the good car, as he called it. As he was talking to his friend Greg outside the fish and chip shop, Cindy pulled up in the good car.
The essence of the conversation was that he was going to pay her back big time. Greg asked, what does he mean by that? He indicated that he would take away the most important things to her. And when Greg asked, what do you mean by that? Cindy was in the fish and chip shop with the kids, and Farquharson has nodded towards the fish and chip shop, indicating to Greg that he meant the kids.
And Greg was horrified and said, for God's sake, Robbie, you don't even think things like that, let alone say them. Nobody thinks things like that. That's your own flesh and blood.
But at the time, Greg just put it down to just Farquharson blowing off steam. And I guess knowing him as well as he did, probably thinking that that he would never ever do that sort of thing.
Greg King's statement was enough for police. On the 14th of December 2005, Robert Farquharson was charged with murdering his 3 children. Throughout the investigation, Cindy had been kept informed of progress. But despite the mounting evidence, she still couldn't comprehend that Robert could be responsible.
So on the day that we were going to charge him, I did go and see Cindy and let her know that that was the day he was going to be charged. And it was a very difficult time for Cindy. That was not what she was expecting.
I was devastated because I couldn't believe he did it. I was in denial.
They said, oh, we're charging him with triple murder. Okay, fair enough. Jared said the same thing to Cindy. She just broke, absolutely hysterical, just broke. Yeah, she was beside herself as far as she was concerned. They were bastards and they were doing the wrong thing, charging him and this and that, and he loved his kids and blah, blah, blah.
She still clung on to that belief that this had to be a terrible accident. There was no way anyone would do such a dreadful thing just to punish her for ending the relationship. She could not get her head around that. So right from the time Robert was charged, she was part of the campaign to clear his name.
The case against Robert Farquharson, charged with murdering his 3 children in September 2005, was building. Police alleged he had deliberately driven his car into a dam and his sons had drowned. In August 2007, that theory would be tested in a highly publicised court case.
And that's what the purpose of a trial is to test the evidence to determine guilt or innocence. Cindy was supporting Farquharson in the first trial and didn't want to believe still at that point that he would deliberately do this to their children.
She was a gift to the defence. She was a gift in that trial because she said all the right things, but the evidence was overwhelming.
It was a 3-month investigation. There were things that we did to investigate the veracity of the story. We found a car that we put in the dam to test how long it was before it filled up with water. To me, that was very compelling, that you had time where you could collect your thoughts, collect the boys, work out a plan and say, this is how we're going to get out. He could have saved at least one of the boys.
Inevitably, the whole trial was under the intense scrutiny of the Australian media, with the court of public opinion even questioning the veracity of the witnesses.
Members of the public couldn't believe that Farquharson could take his 3 children's lives in this fashion. And the negativity that we got on the internet from Facebook and those types of blogs that were set up was terrible. And affected me, got absolutely no doubt about that, affected my family. And it was a very, very stressful time.
I've never been involved in a trial where the atmosphere has been so toxic. No one was conceding anything. It was almost like the defence's view was that We'd been sitting at home and we'd been told about 3 kids killed in a dam, and we decided, well, I better stroll down to Geelong and see if we can find someone guilty of this. I just got the feeling that it just got personal.
On the 2nd of October 2007, 2 days before what would have been Jay's 13th birthday, the jury retired to consider their verdict. 4 days later, they found Robert Farquharson guilty of murdering his children.
I was praying that he was innocent, and when he was convicted, I broke down, like I was taken away in an ambulance.
Cindy and her mother both broke down. For myself, I had tears of joy running down my cheeks. I felt elated. I just thought, yes, you beauty.
Farquharson received a life sentence for each of the 3 counts of murder. The judge refused to set a minimum term for parole. Cindy, meanwhile, was left to continue her search for answers. Answers that certainly weren't forthcoming from Robert in jail.
He doesn't call her, he won't let her be on the visitors list, he won't respond to her letters. She hears that other people, other friends are visiting him, and yet he won't see her. And she started to think, I think she said to me once when I was there, why do you think he won't respond to my letters? I said, why do you think? She said, well, it's not that I think he's guilty, but perhaps he just doesn't want to look at me. Why wouldn't he want to look at you? Why can't he face you? She said, well, I'd know if he were lying. I said, would you? Would you really know if he were lying? She said, I think I would. And maybe that's why he doesn't want to see me. And I thought then, somewhere in there, the thought is germinating, somewhere in there, that he just might not be telling the truth.
There was an initial time where she said, I feel as though he might have done it. She was in doubt for a long, long time until she put all those variables together and all those little bits of facts here and there together. And then she finally conclusively said, I believe he's done. It was a weight lifted, but it was still a long road ahead.
On the 17th of December 2009, it was announced that Robert Farquharson had successfully appealed his conviction.
One of the things that came out of the publicity for the retrial was we actually identified a significant witness who came forward in relation to having been on the highway at the time that Farquharson's car was on the highway and saw pretty much the car go off the road.
Dawn Waite was a farmer's wife from Warrnambool who had been driving along the highway that night behind Robert. She didn't come forward in the first trial because she'd been diagnosed with cancer. She knew he'd been arrested. She felt that she was just another witness. They had a strong enough case. After seeing the coverage of the appeal where he was released pending a new trial, she felt that what she had to say was crucial. What she described was a man on a mission. He was slowing down and braking, as though he was pausing. She decided to overtake him because she felt he might cause an accident. But as she overtook him, she noticed he was transfixed, looking to the right. He wasn't even aware of her passing. He was just fixed, looking to the right. He wasn't coughing when she passed him. He wasn't in the midst of a coughing fit. She looked in a rear vision mirror and she saw the headlights of the car turning off the road to the right. Now, that was the car turning off the road and heading towards the dam. This was not a man slumped over the wheel or coughing in the midst of a coughing fit, as he claimed. It showed him slowing down over a distance, constantly slowing down, driving off, and looking to the right. A man that was looking for that dam. It changed everything.
Dawn Waite's statement to police was enough for Cindy. She was now convinced Robert was responsible for the deliberate murder of Jay, Tyler and Bailey. She contacted the police and changed her statement.
This is too incomprehensible. I can't believe that this person would hate me that much to want to murder his own children who he worshipped, the ground they walked on.
The second trial of Robert Farquharson began on the 5th of May 2010. And for the second time in 3 years, he pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of murdering his sons. Tellingly, Cindy chose to give evidence against her ex-husband.
She was dreading it, absolutely dreading this second trial. But when it came, she said, I was Robert's voice first time round. I spoke up for him. I was loyal to him, and I was misguided. But second time around, my children will have a voice, and I will be their voice.
As powerful and moving as Cindy's testimony was in court, a defining moment came when the accused took the stand.
Farquharson was put in the box and he had a shovel and he dug himself a hole and he never got out of it. I think his evidence was just unbelievably bad. He had clear memories of things that would suggest that he was innocent, and every time things were put to him about, well, how do you say this could happen? Oh, I don't know, I've forgotten. Can't remember. I can't remember was like his biggest answer, I think. He gave evidence like he'd lost his push bike. You know, we weren't talking about the 3 kids, and I think the jury probably saw what we saw at the hospital. And I don't think after you listen to Farquharson you can come to too many other conclusions other than he killed his kids.
The day the jury delivered the verdict was significant because it would have been Tyler's birthday. And for Cindy, that was like a message.
We went and lit a candle at the church and prayed for the truth to come out.
On the 22nd of July 2010, on what would have been Tyler's 12th birthday, Robert Farquharson was found guilty again of murdering his sons. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 33 years.
He's going to be 70-odd when he gets out, if he gets out. Why should he get out? They can't. They were put in a box. They can't get out, ever. So why should he?
There's no closure for me. It's always there. From the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed. There's always birthdays, there's always anniversaries.
What? Mummy do it?
Hate him with a passion. I don't wish death on him because I want him to suffer. I hate him more. I hate what he's done to me.
Turn around.
Bailey, turn around.
Wave to Mummy.
I hate him.
I believe this crime was so shocking because it was out and out revenge.
I think it all comes down to I don't think you realise the value of having a child. Consequently, there's 3 little boys gone.
When 2 people separate, don't use the children as pawns, because you might be that person's ex, but you're not your children's ex.
Cindy said to me once, do you think he didn't love them? I said, I think he did love them. I think he hated you more.
Spanning the length of Australia, from Adelaide to Darwin, the Stewart Highway is 2,834 kilometres long and cuts the continent in half. An isolated and often lonely road. It was here, in 2001, that 2 English backpackers travelling in their VW Combi van met their fate and sparked the biggest manhunt in Northern Territory history.
There was this incredible story, hijacked in the middle of Australia, and her boyfriend was missing.
It's hard to imagine anywhere that's more isolated than the outback.
The person involved in this incident is armed and dangerous.
I couldn't imagine a more frightening and intimidating experience.
That magic combination of the British tourist, the human interest, the murder, the mystery.
There was evidence there was a lot of blood there.
If I could say one thing to this man, I would ask him to let the police know where Pete is.
She's the only one that can actually tell anyone exactly what happened that night.
You can't make up DNA profiles. It's either there or it's not there.
This is the first time I've been exposed to that type of voracious, shark-feeding frenzy of the media.
Everyone had a theory.
The question I have is, where is Peter Falconio?
We really still don't know what happened. We really still don't know.
The incredible story of Peter Falconio and Joanne Lees was a crime that shook Australia. In 2001, English backpackers Joanne Lees and boyfriend Peter Falconio arrived in Australia, halfway through a world trip. They purchased a combi van in Sydney and embarked on an adventure through southeast and central Australia. The couple arrived in Alice Springs, the central heart of Australia, on Thursday, the 12th of July.
Alice Springs was quite a different place then. We didn't really have a crime problem. It was very much a community policing type of style where it was high engagement with people and a great place to live and work. I really enjoyed it.
It's never boring. You know, to me, the world comes to Alice. You don't have to go to the world, you know.
Peter Falconio called his parents in the UK on Friday the 13th of July. The young couple were in good spirits and excited about their travels. The next day, Peter and Joanne headed north on the Stuart Highway towards Darwin.
Joanne and Peter, as we understand it, left Alice Springs around 4 o'clock in the afternoon to head north. They stopped at a place called Tea Tree on the way to get some petrol.
After watching the sunset at Tea Tree Roadhouse, 194 kilometres north of Alice Springs, the couple drove another 100 kilometres towards Darwin, passing Barrow Creek Roadhouse.
They continued on a little bit longer, and Joanne noticed a few fires by the side of the road, not knowing what these were. Peter wanted to stop and put them out. He thought they were a bit dangerous to keep going. But Joanne, feeling a little bit uncomfortable, she said, "No, Pete, let's keep driving. Let's keep driving."
They had been smoking a joint prior to that at Tea Tree, so they might have been a little bit clouded. They may have been, quite sort of dreamy and relaxed and a bit tired, maybe.
My first surprise was that they were still driving and had bypassed, one Tea Tree, two Barrow Creek because it had turned dark, and the signs everywhere in those days were just all about staying off the road at night.
You couldn't pick a more remote area of Australia, and that time of year very cold too.
It's very isolated, very little hope of any type of rescue if you get stuck, unless there is passing traffic, and there's very little of that.
Unless you've got a big moon, it's literally just pitch black. You see nothing, only from what your headlights can throw.
Peter noticed some headlights behind them in the combi and expressed some frustration that the person behind them wasn't trying to overtake, irrespective of how much they slowed the combi down. Eventually, that four-wheel drive pulled out from behind them, travelled along next to them, and the driver indicated that there was a problem with the back of their camper van.
To have someone drive up beside you in the middle of the Australian outback in his ute and gesticulate to you would have been a bit alarming to most people.
Just after 8 p.m, 11 kilometres past Barrow Creek Roadhouse, the couple pulled their combi van over to the side of the Stuart Highway.
The man pulled up behind them as well. Peter got out, and Joanne heard a conversation to the effect that there was some sparks coming out of the exhaust pipe. Peter moved back to the front of the combi van. He said to Joanne, "Get into the driver's seat and rev the engine for me."
Then Peter comes back and picks up his cigarettes and then appears to be quite relaxed, doesn't appear to be threatened in any way, then returns to the rear of the camper van and the discussion continues.
Joanne revved the engine and heard what she thought was the combi van backfiring, as it had done in the past.
In the middle of the outback, in absolute darkness and unfamiliar with the surroundings, the young couple had hoped this stranger would help them during their Australian adventure.
Next thing she knows, a gun pointed at her, and there's a man looking at her through the window.
He then tells Joanne to move over to the passenger seat, and then he proceeds to tie her up.
Stunned and terrified, Joanne's hands were tied behind her back with manacles made from cable ties and tape.
She was in a pretty frightened and terrorised state. She was clearly traumatised by what was going on.
Pushed her out of the van. She didn't know where Pete was. He didn't have the opportunity to restrain her ankles. She was kicking around too much.
He pulled her up, made her stand up, and then guided her past the camper van towards his own vehicle. She never saw Peter's body. She never saw a body at all.
And then somehow he manhandled her into the back of the four-wheel drive.
Screaming and struggling, Joanne Lees lay in the attacker's vehicle, calling desperately for her boyfriend, Peter Falconio.
While she was in the back of the four-wheel drive, she heard some dragging noises, didn't know what they were. She knew that she was probably going to get killed. She was more worried about what would happen before that happened.
Fearful for her life, Joanne Lees made an impulsive and shrewd decision that altered the course of her fate.
She was in fear of her life, and that's what got her out of the back of the truck and running into the bush. She had nothing else to lose.
When you're running into the bush there, you barely see, the bushes in front of you until they're kind of upon you.
The headlights at the time were the only thing that illuminated the scene when Joanne was running for her life through the bushes. It was like a blanket had been put over the world.
I couldn't imagine a more frightening and intimidating experience, knowing that there's really no one to come to your assistance.
In 2001, whilst travelling along an isolated stretch of the Stewart Highway in central Australia, 28-year-old Peter Falconio and his girlfriend Joanne Lees were flagged down by a man in a white four-wheel drive truck. When they pulled over to the side of the road, Peter got out to talk to the man. That moment would be the last time anyone ever saw Peter Falconio alive again. Just after 8:30 p.m, in remote and vast bushland, Joanne Lees crouched beneath a bush hidden in the darkness. Having escaped from the man who had attacked her, she remained motionless as he searched for her with his dog.
He was unable to find her once she, shot off into the bush, and then took a turn and ran 30 metres in another direction. So that saved her life. I've no doubt about that.
He looked for her with a torch. The dog never seemed to find her as well. In fact, the dog just ignored her most of the time, as far as she can recall. She slid under a low piece of scrub and just waited there until he left.
People in Britain and other well-populated countries can't imagine how vast the outback is and how lonely you would be if you were suddenly left to your own devices there, particularly if you thought you were being threatened by an attacker.
It would be probably the most intimidating and scary situations to be in.
Hidden from her attacker and unsure of his whereabouts, Joanne struggled to remove the manacles she was tied with.
She heard some movement of vehicles, assumed that he'd taken the combi away. Then she heard footsteps again and the torchlight once more, and then he drove off in his four-wheel drive.
She was hiding in that shrub for 5 or 6 hours in cold winter temperatures. It would have been a very lonely and traumatic experience for her.
And it wasn't until many hours later that she actually ran out onto the road, risking her life in front of a huge road train trailer that drives along the highway, and that's when Vince Miller stopped and picked her up.
60 metres long, lights all over it, 40 or 50 wheels on the thing making a massive noise, but she had no choice but to try and stop this thing in the middle of the night. That's how desperate she was. And then to trust that person to take her to safety.
Unable to stop suddenly, driver Vince Miller feared he had run over the young woman. Stopping the large truck almost a kilometre down the highway, Vince discovered a distressed and injured Lise, who told him and his co-driver of her ordeal. They embarked on a search for Peter, but stopped soon after Vince learned that the attacker was armed and still at large. They immediately drove Joanne 11 kilometres south to Barrow Creek Roadhouse.
An iconic old outback pub, rough as guts, seemingly full of rough characters and whatever, but really with hearts of gold, salt of the earth people.
Barrow Creek proprietor Les Pilton and his partner Helen Jones looked after Joanne and called the police immediately.
Les would have stopped everything. He would have just worked his guts out to try and sort that situation out.
I got a phone call, being kind of one of the more senior police there, to say that they'd received a report of a young woman being abducted and her boyfriend being murdered. So I immediately went to work, I think 3 or 4 in the morning.
A huge manhunt is underway in the Northern Territory, where a gunman is believed to have kidnapped a British tourist and terrorised his girlfriend.
We consider the person involved in this incident is armed and dangerous.
Within 24 hours, over 100 police, volunteers and aircraft had been deployed in the search for the gunman.
Police set up some roadblocks and there was a huge manhunt going on, and amazing detours around the area were being put in place.
The roadblocks really didn't get enacted until the Sunday morning. So you're talking 12, 16 hours from when it actually happened.
North to Darwin, south to Alice Springs, and even south to South Australia as well. And so if you were going to escape, you'd have had a hard time avoiding the police.
Well, he's long gone, unless he's local. They should have got Aboriginal trackers involved right from day one. The ability of those people is just astonishing. They'll track somebody through vast areas of grass, yet here are some of the best trackers in the entire world, and they weren't really utilised until later, or too late, I think. Yeah.
The police released a composite image of the gunman and his truck, as described by Joanne Lise, in the hope the public would assist in the identification of her attacker.
You just described half of the Territory male population. But as far as that type of Land Cruiser in Alice Springs went, well, they were a dime a dozen.
As police searched for the gunman in the hope of finding Peter alive, blood was discovered at the scene, and forensic biologist Carmen Eckhoff was called in to the investigation.
Very quickly obvious to me that there was an area that had considerable blood. There was more blood than what you could see visibly. And then as you could push away some of the top dirt to then expose some of the blood underneath. So yeah, and you could see actually where it's been flicked up to try and cover up the scene.
They'd found the camper van a little further up the highway, parked off the side of the road in deep bush, some distance from where Joanne had been hiding.
I was asked to examine the combi van. Obviously we were looking for blood. We also took out some other items, took a sample of the steering wheel and the gear shift. And the reason being is whoever drove the car must have had to have held it to get it over the rough terrain. Basically, we use a technique of tape lifting, where we take just ordinary sticky tape and essentially go around the steering wheel collecting cellular material. The sample was then put into a sterilised container and it came back with me when I went back to the lab in Darwin for analysis.
4 days after the attack, Peter Falconio's father and brother arrived from the UK. Taken to the site at Barrow Creek, they made a public appeal for any information. As media interest intensified, Joanne Leese remained elusive, and everyone was keen to see and hear from the woman at the centre of the incident.
Media, from not just Australian media, but from all over the world, sort of gravitated towards Alice Springs. So every time you drive your car in and out, you were kind of fighting between vans of cameras, and it consumed the town. It was huge.
Joanne was reluctant to talk about what had happened. She was reluctant to go into any detail about the actual incident. And reporters generally want as much information as possible for their story. Despite the police efforts to try to persuade her to open up and to talk to the media, she kept her lips tightly sealed.
That was probably the main difficulty in terms of trying to formulate a story.
A lot of people just don't know how to handle sudden media attention.
Amid the unprecedented media frenzy and search for word from Joanne Leese, local journalist Mark Wilton received a phone call from Helen Jones, a friend from Barrow Creek Roadhouse who was looking after Joanne.
It was very early on Monday morning that Joanne was with her. She explained to me that Joanne had read the papers, had seen what was in the papers. She wasn't happy with some of the inaccuracies in the story that she'd read so far. The other papers turned up later in the day and they got worse. Joanne was actually quite upset about them.
The information wasn't coming out from the police as much as we would like to have received it, and certainly we were getting no news out of Joanne. In terms of that, yes, of course, news agencies start to create conjecture as to perhaps what the stories were.
As hundreds of media descended on the small town in pursuit of a story or glimpse of Joanne, Mark Wilton was invited to an interview to clarify issues Joanne had with media reports.
She wouldn't answer anything to do with the actual incident, as it were, because she'd been asked not to. Police didn't even know she was doing the interview, mind you, but she said, I don't really feel as though I should. And a lot of that she did say was out of respect for Pete's family. She said she'd never at any stage said she heard a gunshot, what she thought was a gunshot. She thought it was the combi backfiring. She just wanted to set the record straight on a few things. I found exactly what I thought. Somebody who'd been through something quite traumatic.
11 days after the attack, Joanne Leese finally agreed to face the media. Accompanied by Peter's brother, Paul Falconio, Joanne made a brief, prepared statement.
If I could say one thing to this man who did this, I would ask him to let the police know where Pete is.
It wasn't going to be any ordinary media conference. She wanted to stage it on her terms. Her terms were, I want a list of questions beforehand.
She wasn't going to talk to the media en masse. It was not going to be a press conference as we kind of thought it would be.
She was given a list of questions by the police and she crossed 10 of them off. I don't want to talk about this, I don't want to talk about this, I don't want to talk about that.
Anyone that's spoken to me or has been in contact with me, no one doubts me.
And the comments that she made in that press conference kind of stung a little bit because we'd only been in this story for 11 days so far, but she'd already created this rift between, I guess, what the international media and the local media were looking for and what her perspective on it was.
It didn't really change anything. It sort of opened up more questions than anything else.
Joanne's conduct had become cause for concern and frustration, and public speculation about her inaccuracies in evidence would cause further tension and doubt.
There have been suspicions about her story. In an attempt to put the rumours to rest, Territory Police for the first time produced photos of the injuries she received that night.
Although there was evidence at the scene, there wasn't a whole lot of it. So there was still too many questions to answer. And of course the police have to discount the people who are so close to the victim to start off with to make sure to rule them out. But I don't think they necessarily ruled her out entirely as far as the media were concerned.
People expect victims to act in a particular way, and when they don't do that, they then create a bit of mistrust around them. So I think that's what happened with Joanne. She knew that there was people who were investigating the matter that just didn't believe her.
I knew that the English press were tough, but it wasn't until I received that note back from just one news editor out of the many that I was dealing with that said, "We reckon she did it." And then I thought, hang on a sec, there's another story going on here.
In 2001, Joanne Lees was abducted at gunpoint on a remote stretch of highway in central Australia. She was kidnapped by an unknown assailant and her boyfriend Peter was missing. Joanne managed to escape into bushland, where she hid for hours before flagging down a passing road train that took her to safety. Despite pleas from the police, Joanne remained hidden from the media until she finally faced the cameras. After Joanne's press conference, wild and unsubstantiated accusations circulated, forcing her further into retreat. Northern Territory police were overwhelmed with the influx of media, whose pursuit for information was unrelenting. When news of CCTV footage surfaced,
there'd been a rumour, a suggestion, that the gunman or the attacker had been caught on CCTV footage at an Alice Springs service station. But no CCTV footage had emerged.
I think it was 19 days, I think roughly after the incident, when we knew about the video.
Where had that footage gone to? Why had the police not used it to find the attacker and publish those pictures on the TV and the internet and the newspaper?
The story was that they sent it away to get enhanced. You know, you've got to realise that this footage at the time had what they believed was, you know, the truck that he was driving, and they didn't even put that out.
You know, it was critical that we tried to get the registration number of the vehicle, and we tried everything, the most sophisticated technology to be able to do that.
You could have identified the car off the CCTV.
I don't think anyone would doubt that it could have been handled a whole lot better.
I think also in defence of the team, we were consumed with thousands of lines of inquiry. Where we went wrong is how we prioritised what was important and what wasn't.
5 months into the investigation, amid a task force shake-up and mounting frustration with media pressure and police procedure, a new lead detective was appointed.
I got a phone call from Paul White, who was just taken over as the new commissioner, and said, "Congratulations, you're now taking over the Falconio investigation." I put the phone down and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, in all honesty, because it didn't seem to be particularly well organised.
In 2001, Colleen Gwynn was the regional superintendent for the Central Region in Alice Springs.
I observed for probably about a week, and it was clear to me that we had a task force that wasn't gelling very well. There was people there that I don't think were there for the right reasons, and there was a number of people that didn't actually believe the victim. So when you're investigating a major crime such as this, you have to believe the victim. Otherwise you will get careless and you'll miss things. So the first thing I did was get some detectives on aeroplanes and go and follow up what I saw was the priority inquiries. And I think that's probably one of the best decisions I ever made.
Months after her traumatic experience, Joanne Lees returned to the UK, disillusioned with the police and wary of the media.
Oh, she was angry. She was frustrated. She didn't trust us. She didn't believe that we had the ability to be able to investigate this matter. Yeah, look, we got a lot of things wrong. We spent some time with her. We were able to clarify some of the areas that were perhaps a little bit confusing. It then also reinforced my view that we had someone who was a remarkable witness. It was just incredible, that her recollection and her ability to articulate things that happened in the most traumatic event that anyone could ever go through.
Task force members whittled down the number of suspects from 3,000 to 26 men. They had assembled a DNA profile and possible identity of a suspect they were particularly interested in locating.
We had a DNA profile from an unknown male, and that residual was very similar to the DNA profile that we found on the back of the T-shirt that belonged to Joanne.
With the discovery of a DNA profile, the task force were hopeful to compare results with national and international databases. Disappointingly, there was no match.
That was a beautiful profile. We got a full DNA picture from it. That unknown profile that we found on the T-shirt is also present on the gear stick and on the steering wheel, which just gives a bit more weight to the police saying, well, if they find this person, then they know they can ask the questions and interrogate them to say, well, you know, we also know that you were in the vehicle. How come your DNA's in the vehicle?
Carmen Eckhoff was our forensic expert here and did an outstanding job. I think Carmen was such a critical part of our case. The forensic area was critical. So they were there side by side with us for a lot of time during the preparation of our case.
Forensics meticulously tested the manacles with which the attacker had tied Joanne's wrists.
The manacles were a homemade attempt of making handcuffs, made with cable ties and black tape. Even though she was handcuffed at the back, she managed to skimmy out of them, and everybody was very disbelieving of it. But she was able to do it because they'd put that extra link in the manacle. There was a lot of strawberry lip gloss on the manacles, which Joanne had with her and was using to try and grease up to try and get out of it. It sort of masks any fingerprints that you may have found on the manacles when he tightened them. We had to find ways of getting tape to lift without damaging any DNA that could be underneath. Mostly it was Joanne's DNA on the outer surfaces, but further underneath the tape we did find traces of DNA from an unknown person.
With the discovery of DNA in the manacles, the forensics team sought out the expertise of Dr. Jonathan Whittaker, an English DNA scientist who specialised in low copy number, a sensitive DNA profiling technique that amplifies the levels of DNA from small amounts of starting material.
I actually sent him the results I'd received when we attempted it in our lab, and asked him if, you know, he would think that that was good enough quality to report on. And it was decided that I should take the centre loop manacle that we hadn't actually examined at all, and I was to take that over to Jonathan and his team for him to do the low copy number. The results were essentially the same. Theirs was, their results were a little more clearer, if you like, but because their technique had been peer reviewed, it meant that the results could be accepted by the courts.
The DNA evidence was pivotal, and police were keen to find one suspect from early in the investigation and verify his DNA. Finding him, however, would prove a difficult and onerous task.
Bradley Murdoch was one of the early suspects in the hunt for the Outback gunman. He was interviewed by police in Broome, who accepted his alibi.
It was clear that his behaviour and what he'd done following the events of the 14th of July were odd, and he'd changed his appearance, he'd changed the appearance of his vehicle. He was acting like a man who was running away from something. We should have made him more of a priority, and if we did, we would have had him much sooner.
Murdoch was known to the police for different reasons. As it turned out, you know, he was painted as somebody who was definitely involved in the drug game.
43-year-old Bradley Murdoch lived in Broome in northwestern Australia. He was known to police as a local drug runner and served time for reckless use of a firearm. Questioned in 2001, local police accepted his alibi, after he stressed he couldn't have driven the 1,943 kilometres back to Broome within 24 hours after the alleged incident.
That came up time and time again. You couldn't have done it. You couldn't have committed the crime, gotten back to Alice Springs and then head down the Tanami and made it to Broome. We did a reenactment with a similar car, similar weighted down, the same, pretty much followed it to a T, and we made it within plenty of time. And that was a critical part. There was more than enough time for Bradley Murdoch to do what he did and arrive in Broome.
As forensic and task force investigators closed in on Bradley Murdoch, he went to ground.
Well, Murdoch was spending a lot of his time in South Australia in the Riverland, living on the guest house of a Swan Reach property that was owned by a man, a woman and a young child. He was turning that guest house into a bit of a bunker. turning into a bolt hole that he could hide in.
He was ready to go. He was on the run. He knew we were after him, and he knew it was only a matter of days before we turned up and arrested him. So he had packed his vehicle up and he was going to hide. He was heading off to Western Australia, somewhere where he couldn't be found. So he was on the move.
We got word that Murdoch had been arrested and was going to stand trial in Adelaide for rape, specifically the unlawful sexual intercourse with a 12-year-old girl and the rape of her mother.
But it's his DNA that could also hold the key on the night Peter Falconio disappeared.
I knew that they had a bloke for a long time they were very keen on being able to get hold of, but I do know that DNA was an issue for them. And their break came in South Australia, basically.
So he was charged in South Australia, and I met him while he was on remand in Yatala prison. He wouldn't give us an interview at the time, but he did have a long conversation with us about his involvement or non-involvement in our matter here in the Northern Territory. Quite an intimidating man. We didn't actually address the evidence. He spoke and he raised different components of our evidence. Obviously the truck stop video, because it had been all over the news hundreds of times. So he wanted to let us know that, yeah, that was him, but it wasn't on the night that we're referring to.
We were left with a truly bizarre situation. We were allowed to name Bradley Murdoch within South Australia with regard to the rape case. We were not allowed to link him to being a suspect to the Falconio case, because as the defence had said from the very start, their case was that this matter had been created, fabricated, that their client was being framed purely to get his DNA onto the public record so that it could be used in the Falconio case.
There was no doubt in my mind that he was panicking underneath his kind of tough exterior where he was trying to intimidate me. Inside, I imagine that there was absolute panic.
After little physical evidence was found to support the rape and abduction charges, Bradley Murdoch was acquitted after the jury's verdict was not unanimous.
The judge turned to Murdoch in the dock of the court, said, "Mr. Murdoch, you're free to go." As the sheriff's officer opened the door to the dock, the Northern Territory Police that had been perched for 2 weeks flooded into the dock, trying to push the sheriff's officer away to grab Murdoch.
We had to be in a position to execute an arrest warrant and get him up to the Territory, which we did the day that he was acquitted in South Australia. We were there and took him into custody.
Grabbed him by the top of the head and shoved him, basically folded him, because he's such a tall man, into the back of this car while the media's filming it. The Territory coppers watched the car go off and say, "See you in Darwin."
After dramatic scenes inside the Adelaide courthouse, Bradley Murdoch was arrested and transported to Darwin to face charges over the murder of Peter Falconio. In 2001, after Peter Falconio went missing, police searched every corner of Australia, looking for the man Joanne had described as being responsible. After 2 years, police believed they had their man. 43-year-old Bradley Murdoch, a known drug runner, was arrested in South Australia and extradited to Darwin to face charges for the murder of Peter Falconio.
But he was a large man. He was known colloquially as Big Brad amongst his contemporaries and colleagues. So he was very imposing.
Circumstantially, it read very, very badly for Murdoch.
We had a great legal team. We had a great case, and we knew that, and we'd done our homework, and we knew we were presenting a matter that would be committed to trial, absolutely.
Yesterday, Territory Police matched Murdoch's DNA with blood found on the T-shirt of Peter Falconio's girlfriend, Joanne Lees.
In May 2004, 2 years and 9 months after the attack, Joanne Lees arrived back in Australia to face Bradley Murdoch at the committal hearing.
If there was any anxiety, it was probably around Joanne's welfare. She was back in the Northern Territory. It's a place that doesn't have a lot of great memories for her.
Joanne was arriving in a police squad car, unmarked, driving at breakneck speed.
So that didn't do her any favours whatsoever. Had she just come to the court, walked along the pavement in a normal manner, then everything would have been fine. She might have got a lot of attention, but certainly it wouldn't have attracted the negative publicity that she got as a result of the car.
There was issues with the transportation of Joanne to and from the court and her safety and the attention and the perception that still she wasn't a credible witness.
The committal was pretty brutal for her. I mean, the journos were pretty cruel with her.
During the committal hearing, startling evidence emerged about an affair Joanne had in Sydney in 2001. Her reliability as a witness, police procedure and contaminated DNA evidence were all called into question. Despite the salacious revelations, after 5 weeks of hearings, Bradley Murdoch was ordered to stand trial.
We had to then get our case together. The work really started, and it was like our second phase. We got our man, now let's get him convicted.
On the 17th of October 2005, the criminal trial began. Peter Falconio's family returned to Australia, and Joanne Lees possessed a confidence not publicly seen before.
When the court case came around, she was very much more professional in her presentation. She even strode up the front steps of the courthouse, acknowledged the media.
Bradley John Murdoch maintained his innocence and entered a plea of not guilty. His legal team were confident leading into the trial.
When Bradley Murdoch appeared in court, he looked like a man who was pretty confident about being found not guilty.
I do know that he intimidated a lot of the witnesses just with his mere presence.
There was something like 80 witnesses called, more than 200 pieces of evidence.
A surprise witness for the prosecution was James Heppy, a former associate, friend and housemate of Murdoch's. His evidence would prove controversial and elicit a vicious exchange between both men in court.
He was a man that had a disgruntled relationship with Bradley John Murdoch, no doubt about that, and the jury were directed to take his evidence.
He was trying to negotiate his way out of a long prison sentence. He said to the police, if you look after me, then I will help you convict Bradley Murdoch.
My problem with Heppy is that it's tainted evidence no matter what you do with Heppy. It's, you know, he's a former partner of Murdoch's.
After volatile scenes inside the courtroom, the case continued, and British DNA scientist Dr. Jonathan Whittaker took to the stand.
The DNA evidence was certainly very well prepared, presented in court, and even the 3 judges made the comment that the DNA evidence is watertight and that Murdoch's team would not be able to have that DNA thrown out.
There was a lot of doubt about the whole DNA business. There was a lot of doubt about the so-called low copy number DNA and whether or not it could be expanded and could be used as a match against Murdoch's DNA.
Whether you believe or don't believe in low copy number, ultimately it's the whole case that goes before the court and is judged against. I'm a firm believer that you can't make up DNA profiles. It's either there or it's not there.
Murdoch's defence lawyer, Grant Algie, questioned the contamination of DNA in the manacles, claiming poor police procedure and tampering of evidence.
I think our biggest issue with DNA is contamination. I was asked to retest the homemade manacles, and I think it came out in court that my director at the time, Dr. Peter Thatcher, had his DNA turn up. The testing is so sensitive, it's really difficult to say exactly how it got there. I can't answer that, but I'm expected in court to then give an answer. So I was against retesting, but I was forced to do it.
The DNA evidence and the eyewitness evidence of Joanne are the only 2 things that, that could put him. Everything else was totally circumstantial.
What I think we've all lost sight of is the fact that even though we have DNA evidence, it's still up to the police to piece together the whole case to present that for the courts, and then it's for the courts to decide.
In the last days of the trial, the defendant Bradley John Murdoch took to the stand.
He had to take the stand because some of the evidence against him had become so damning. And Rex Wild, who is one of the most incredible prosecutors, stood up and said to Bradley John Murdoch, "Where did you bury Peter Falconio?" That was his first question. And it took Bradley John Murdoch by surprise, to the point that he actually appeared somewhat insulted. Look, we knew that Bradley John Murdoch was a bad man, and I guess those layers began to peel off as the questioning continued. But there was really nothing that Bradley John Murdoch offered to the court in his testimony that discounted the fact that he was the man that committed this crime.
After a 9-week trial that heard allegations of controversial and contaminated evidence, a witness who was unfaltering in her story, and a defendant that staunchly denied guilt, the jury returned with a verdict.
A Darwin jury found Bradley John Murdoch is the Outback killer, declaring him guilty of the British tourist's murder.
There was a unanimous guilty verdict from the jury, guilty after guilty after guilty.
I think probably the jury made the right decision in the circumstances. Whether it reflected the accuracy and the truth of the crime remains to be seen.
I wouldn't have convicted him on the evidence that was presented in the court.
I was just happy that we could play our part and get a conviction and put Bradley Murdoch behind bars for 28 years.
After the verdict, Joanne Lees and the Falconio family addressed the media outside the courthouse.
I'm obviously delighted with the unanimous verdict given here today.
Most important thing to my family now is to find Peter's body.
Bradley John Murdoch was jailed for a non-parole period of 28 years, while Joanne Lees was pursued by continuous speculation as to the credibility of her story. A story that has reportedly earned her over $500,000. Murdoch unsuccessfully appealed his conviction and is currently serving a life sentence in Darwin's Berrima jail. He maintains his innocence as public speculation continues about the incident and the whereabouts of Peter Falconio.
I've always felt that there is another chapter to be written in this story. What really happened to Peter Falconio? What was the motive? Who killed him? Was it really Bradley Murdoch?
This is the case in Australia that never ends, and I don't think there will be any conclusion until perhaps the remains of Peter Falconio are found or someone with more information about the case comes forward.
It's just a pity that someone lost their life here, and I guess with Joanne, she lives with this every day. And the Falconios are still without their son, who they don't know where he is. So you have to remember about the people that are part of this, and that's not us, but it's them.
Until that body is found, we will not know one way or the other categorically what happened to Peter Falconio.
A hot summer day in Melbourne, and commuters on the Westgate Bridge are left stunned by a senseless act of violence.
It was just too shocking, so the first instinct was not to believe it.
At the centre of this appalling crime was one man, a father, and shockingly, the victim was his own daughter.
When he asked Freeman what he'd done, he didn't answer, just got back into his car and drove off.
You just don't know how anyone can murder anyone, but to do it to your own flesh and blood, it just begs belief.
Paramedics worked for an hour at the scene, trying to revive 4-year-old Darcy Freeman.
That her father was involved, it automatically appalls you, and it's just beyond belief, really.
I've been a policeman for 34 years, and that's as upset as I've been in terms of investigations that I've overseen.
Faced with silence from the father, questions needed to be asked. Just how could somebody commit such an atrocity?
They'd gone to 5 different psychologists to find out why this man had acted this way. You know, was he mad or bad?
The chilling story of the tragic death of Darcy Freeman was a crime that shook Australia. On a hot January morning in 2009, a man drove his car to Melbourne's Commonwealth Law Courts. He carefully reverse parked, fed the meter, and then led his 2 young sons inside.
He arrives at court, picks up his son and says, "Take my child." And they have no idea what's going on.
Almost catatonic was the way that I would describe him. He wasn't at all responsive, clearly upset.
And he's standing, looking out, and his boys are at his feet, and he's shaking, and he looks like he's sobbing, but you can't see his face. And all his staff are milling around him. And I cannot get that image out of my head.
The man's name is Arthur Freeman, a 37-year-old tech worker from Melbourne. Hours before the confusing scenes at the law courts, Arthur was preparing to drive his sons to school on their first day back from the summer holidays. Also in the car, excited about her very first day at school, was his 4-year-old daughter, Darcy.
It was Darcy's first day at school.
That excitement, especially in the middle of summer, a hot morning, and they were coming from a family holiday, so Darcy's dad was to drop her off for school that day, so there would have been that air of excitement.
Darcy Freeman was 4 years old, described by family members as a determined and strong-willed young girl. She was especially close to her 2 brothers. In 2009, Darcy's family was in a state of turmoil, with her parents Arthur and Peter divorced and locked in a bitter custody battle.
The day before, Freeman had his access to his children reduced by a court.
It appears that Darcy's father was quite angry about that outcome in terms of his access to his children and in terms of financial settlement.
So he'd left the house and his dad had been, "You're really emotional, I'll drive with you." And he'd said no. He now has to live with not getting in that car for the rest of his life.
With his 3 children in the back of the car, Arthur Freeman made the 130-kilometre journey from his parents' holiday home in Aireys Inlet to Melbourne. The plan was to meet his ex-wife, Darcy's mum, at the school gates, so she could hand over a school uniform ready for her first day.
He'd driven from his parents' place down near Geelong. He'd stopped the car at the top of the Westgate Bridge.
A main commuter link from the southwest of Melbourne, the Westgate Bridge is an iconic sight across the city.
It's got a real history, the Westgate Bridge. It collapsed back when it was being constructed. It's certainly an icon in Melbourne and takes a whole lot of traffic out to the west and from the west into the city every morning. So really high volume, and in the peak hour in the morning, most of that volume is coming from the west and travelling towards the city.
Well, any approach into Melbourne on an aeroplane, you can see the Westgate Bridge. It always seems to stand out. It covers the, sort of comes across the river where the river meets the bay, so it's a very long area, and it's visible from just about everywhere in Melbourne.
I don't like driving on that bridge. I've never really liked it. It's not a pleasant place to be. It's high up and it's windy, and you only go over that bridge when you have to.
Just after 9 a.m. on the 29th of January 2009, as his children played games in the back of the car, Arthur Freeman had made a series of frantic phone calls on the 90-minute journey to Melbourne. As the temperature increased outside, so too did Arthur's stress levels. At the midpoint of the bridge, he made a decision that would have a devastating impact on the lives of so many people.
He'd asked Darcy to climb into the front seat. He then carried her to the rail and threw her over the bridge.
The height of the bridge is 58 metres. This inexplicable act, carried out just after 9 a.m. during the morning rush hour, was done in full view of commuters.
So the witnesses were saying, I thought it was a doll, or I don't know what I've just seen. I can't imagine how affected you would be.
Hello, I've just witnessed a man throw a child over the Westgate Bridge.
Thrown a child, did you say?
Yes, blonde hair and a ponytail.
Some of them said that they couldn't believe what they were seeing, that they thought it must have been a teddy bear. They just couldn't reconcile it.
The idea that you can get up and go through the motions, eat your breakfast, get in your car and drive to work, and as you're driving to work in, peak hour traffic, you watch someone pull over, put their hazard lights on and throw their daughter over a bridge.
You can't get much more public than driving across Westgate Bridge in peak hour traffic on a weekday in Melbourne. That's about as public as it gets, and to stop your car in full view of other drivers and do what he did. I guess just the normality of it, just driving along and to see someone stop on the bridge would have, you can only imagine what they would have sort of, witnessed.
Moments before Arthur threw Darcy from the bridge, a truck had passed with a dash-mounted camera.
There was a four-wheel drive or a truck that drove over the bridge with a video camera that ran on a continuous loop. And we've got his car with its hazard lights on the side of the bridge pulled over, so immediately before throwing Darcy off the bridge. And I remember being really glad that he didn't actually capture that moment, because it's not something that I really wanted my investigators to have to watch.
As the commuters were left stunned by the events unfolding before them, Arthur Freeman quietly headed back to his car.
Freeman threw Darcy off the bridge and then calmly got back in the car.
He drove down and stopped at the bottom of the bridge. Her brother kept saying, "You've got to go back, you've got to go back, Darcy can't swim." Not knowing that she'd fallen nearly 60 metres over the side of the bridge.
Darcy can't swim, Dad. From the eyes of an innocent child, he wouldn't have understood how devastating that fall was going to be. And in his head, he knew there was water there, so yeah, Darcy can't swim.
With the police alerted and the country not yet aware of the tragedy, Arthur Freeman continued to drive his two sons away from the scene, unaware his daughter Darcy, having survived the fall, fought for her life below. When police, ambulance and the media first received calls to respond, they all thought there must have been a mistake. A man had thrown his young daughter from Melbourne's Westgate Bridge, 58 metres into the water below.
I think the general reaction in the newsroom was disbelief. It was a case of going, what? That doesn't sound right. And the police were saying, look, we don't know, we can't confirm it, but that's what we're hearing.
I remember getting the call that someone had been thrown from the Westgate Bridge. And I remember thinking there must be a mistake, this just can't be right.
We thought it was going to be wrong. We thought that within half an hour, it would clarify itself. Maybe it was a doll, maybe it was something else.
And I thought that all the way, even driving to there, I thought there's got to be a better explanation for this, but unfortunately there wasn't. That's exactly what had happened. As distressing as they are, the facts are fairly straightforward, that he's got out of the car, taken this young girl and dropped her over the side of the bridge.
I think people do react differently when it comes to children because of the helplessness of the children, the dependency that the children have on adults.
And to have that violated is horrific.
When police and ambulance crews arrived at the scene, the tragedy was confirmed and everybody worked tirelessly to save the little girl, who had been in the water for 15 minutes and incredibly was still alive.
Darcy had been recovered from the water. I think it was the water police had a boat and fished her out of the water. So by then I knew what had happened. It was fairly chaotic. There was a lot of police there, both uniform and detectives, and a whole lot of media there, everyone trying to work out and make some sense as to what had occurred.
Everybody was affected by it because it was so public. He'd also involved everybody else in it. He'd involved those people driving to work. He'd involved the paramedics that had to resuscitate her at the bottom.
The emergency service workers and who did everything, and the doctors who did everything they could to try to save her. Yeah, it's remarkable. That really struck me.
That was a really tough job for the police and the ambulance that had got there immediately. But at the time you're so busy that's not the critical time. I think people cope better when they've got tasks to do. And there was a whole lot to do in terms of Darcy and her care.
As rescue crews frantically tried to keep young Darcy alive, Arthur Freeman drove to the Commonwealth Law Courts, handed over his 2 sons, and waited for the world to grasp the enormity of his actions.
When he drove off, he drove then through busy peak hour traffic to reverse parked and put money in the meter at a parking bay. He then walked into the federal court with his 2 sons and says, "Take my child."
Police arrived at the Commonwealth Law Courts at 10:30 a.m, 90 minutes after Arthur Freeman threw his daughter Darcy from the Westgate Bridge.
And his boys are at his feet, and he's shaking, and he looks like he's sobbing, but you can't see his face.
Unable to comprehend the enormity of the situation, Arthur's eldest son told the court guards his parents' names. When police arrived, the 2 young boys were cared for by court counsellors.
Arthur was conveyed back to the homicide squad office. A tape was turned on. He almost catatonic was the way that I would describe him. He wasn't at all responsive, clearly upset. So we had to get a forensic medical officer in to examine him, a doctor who made a determination that he was unfit for interview.
In a strange way, it kind of came to a conclusion very quickly.
It wasn't long after that Freeman was arrested. And I do remember the Premier did a press conference that day, I guess just in a bid to in an attempt to put some words to what had happened, to try to capture some of the grief and shock that people were feeling.
I just shuddered when I heard about it. I think every Victorian, you just shudder. You just think, how can that happen?
I don't think Melbourne or even Australia had seen or heard about something like this on this scale.
With Arthur Freeman now in custody, ambulance crews had worked on Darcy for over an hour before her tiny body was transported to hospital for intensive care.
She had some brain injuries, some severe internal injuries and some bruising. The police that attended commenced CPR, as did the ambulance when they arrived, and that continued until she got to hospital.
As news spread of the shocking event, police had the daunting task of informing Darcy's mother, who had been waiting outside the school.
There were 2 members of the homicide squad that went out to pick up Darcy's mum and take her to the hospital. Darcy had been taken to hospital, so we had some homicide squad members with her and some uniformed members with her, and that's just a really tough day at work.
Darcy Freeman was flown directly to the Royal Children's Hospital, where emergency staff continued their efforts to keep the little girl alive. When Peter Barnes arrived to see her daughter, sadly, she was forced to make a heartbreaking decision.
She'd had to stand there in the hospital and tell the staff to turn off her daughter's life support, and that she did cradle her daughter as she died.
Despite the efforts of ambulance and hospital staff, at 1:35 p.m, Nearly 4.5 hours after being thrown from the Westgate Bridge by her father, 4-year-old Darcy Iris Freeman died.
Darcy Freeman was 4. She hadn't lived at all.
It's really, any time there's young children involved, it's really difficult. And young Darcy, she was a young 4-year-old girl, really attractive. We've all got a maternal and paternal instinct, and she's died in a terrible way in tragic circumstances through no fault of her own. So in some ways you shouldn't say that some murders or deaths are worse than others, but clearly these circumstances, they're really difficult to get your head around. And I've been a policeman for 34 years and that's as upset as I've been in terms of investigations that I've overseen.
The repercussions of Arthur Freeman's actions were felt across the entire city of Melbourne. People were in shock, trying to understand how someone could deliberately harm a child in such a shocking and public way.
How can a man throw his daughter 58 metres to her death? What's the explanation there? And a lot of people were saying, well, he's got to be crazy, hasn't he?
As Arthur Freeman sat behind bars, legal teams and health professionals endeavoured to build a case to comprehend his actions. It was 2 years after the tragic death of Darcy Freeman that her father, Arthur, stood trial. He had entered a plea of not guilty. Legal teams took time to consider Arthur's psychological health, personal history, the family law court decision, family and witness statements, and every mitigating detail related to the case.
The general reaction to covering that trial was people would say, so what are you covering? And you tell them, and they'd say, oh, I can't listen to that, I turn that off. It was people, especially people with young children, were saying, I turn that off when it comes on telly, I turn it off when you're on the radio, I don't listen to that. It's too upsetting.
Darcy's name comes up and you can see the shake of their head, people don't want to talk about it.
There was just something special about poor little Darcy, you know, and what happened to her and the way it was done. It's just it shocked everyone.
As the media converged on the first day of the court case, everyone was keen to see Darcy's mother, Peter Barnes.
We'd never seen Peter Barnes, we'd never seen Darcy's mum. And she lived in WA, so she'd travelled over to do this case. We were aware that that was going to be extremely confronting and that this woman was going through a lot at the time.
There was a respect in the way the media reported the case, and it's a really difficult situation that they find themselves in because there's a need for the news to get out. It's got a whole lot of public interest, not despite the fact that it's so tragic. So they've got a responsibility to report on what had occurred, but they've obviously got kids and they obviously can't be unaffected by what happened. They handled themselves really well.
It was organised with a detective to ask the family if they would consider essentially reenacting a walk for us. So we agreed with Darcy's mum, Peter Barnes, that if we filmed her once, that was the shot we were going to use for the whole trial. It's extremely unheard of, but we decided that she should be given space.
As the trial began, all eyes were on the man who had callously thrown his daughter from the bridge.
Arthur Freeman arrived at court looking like this dishevelled, crazy guy. He had crazy hair. He was later described as a Rasputin-like mad monk kind of image that he portrayed. He was dishevelled and he just sat. I remember he sat in the dock just staring gormlessly.
I don't know what explanation Mr. Freeman could provide that would make any sense to me or to anybody else.
A lot of people were saying, well, he's got to be crazy, hasn't he? Because in a lot of people's minds, that was the only explanation you could have. That man's mad.
It's very difficult, I think, very difficult for me and very difficult for a lot of people to understand why the offender would overcome all his own values and kill a child.
So on the very first day it was set out, the arguments, the prosecution stood up and spoke to the jury and said, this man wasn't mad. This man killed his own daughter as an ultimate act of revenge against his ex-wife because they were going through a bitter custody battle. And so from then on, that was the argument. Was he bad or mad?
Arthur Freeman's ex-wife Peter Barnes sat in court throughout the entire proceedings, supported by her family.
I don't know how a mother can sit through that and listen to what occurred.
We were very conscious that not only was Darcy's mum there and her family. You go into court as a court reporter and you brace yourself, going, okay, you have to steel yourself against this. But that wasn't the case with Peter Barnes. She took to the stand and she was stoic, she was polite, calm, firm. If he had done this to get back at her, to hurt her, which obviously he had to an extreme extent, she was not going to let him see that.
She had got to that stage where she wasn't going to let him hurt her, and she was quite dignified as the way she delivered her evidence and did a terrific job in giving her evidence under the circumstances.
As the trial continued, the defence put forward their case regarding Arthur Freeman's actions that day.
The argument put forward by the defence was that he was disassociating, they called it, acting like an automaton, like a robot, like acting without conscious thought behind it. And that he did that in that split second when he threw her over the bridge.
I'm not convinced that people offending in that manner are unaware of the wrongness of the behaviour.
Well, the prosecution made a point of telling the jury that they'd gone to 5 different psychologists to find out why this man had acted this way. And all of them had agreed that he knew what he was doing and that he knew right from wrong when he was doing it, and that his act would cause real and significant harm to his child, if not kill her.
During the trial, the jury heard details about the phone calls Arthur Freeman made in the lead-up to Darcy's death. Arthur had spoken with his sister, making no reference to any pending tragedy, instead worrying about his children's school lunches and being late for Darcy's first day. Another call to a close friend in the UK relayed his fears about losing his kids, feeling helpless and being surrounded by angry women in the courts who were not supportive of fathers. He spoke to her of pursuing greater custody through the courts and offered no warning of the horror ahead. The call ended when her phone battery went dead. At 8:54 a.m, Arthur received a phone call from his ex-wife, Peter Barnes. She was concerned Arthur was running late to drop Darcy off.
That's been the catalyst, and for some reason that catalyst has been more powerful than their own awareness of the life of their kid, and that's very difficult to understand.
As Arthur Freeman approached the Westgate Bridge, the terrifying words he uttered over the phone to his ex-wife were a forewarning of his appalling actions.
The words he said to his ex-wife over the phone moments before, say goodbye to your children, that are just chilling. And they probably illustrate his intentions at the time and probably his motives in terms of spousal revenge.
I kill the wife, it's not going to make much difference. I kill the child, my own child, it's going to affect the mother for the rest of her life. You know, something she's never going to get over and never will in any way, shape or form.
When the defence's psychologist was saying, Well, no, he was disassociating. The question put to him was, well, why did he do all those other rational things? He acted certainly like anybody else would act when they were driving in peak hour traffic. He's on a bridge in peak hour traffic, but he remembers to put his hazard lights on when he pulls to the side. If somebody is disassociating and not acting consciously, why would they do that? That's a very rational thing to do.
As witnesses testified and evidence was put forward, Arthur Freeman sat silently in the dock, showing very little emotion.
The pathologist came and detailed in very specific detail about the injuries that Darcy Freeman had sustained in that fall, and that was the only time that Arthur Freeman in the dock showed any emotion whatsoever, and he started to wipe tears away from his eyes.
A lot of people actually do feel remorse once they're locked up. So we go see them in these cells after they've been charged or during the trial, and some are actually remorseful. Few, not everyone, but some are actually remorseful and contrite. And if they are, it makes the job easier to be able to tell the judge something about them. If they're not, and they come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful issues of mitigation, then I hope we lose them.
I think most of us went to court wanting to understand how a man could throw his 4-year-old child 58 metres to her death. And most people that you spoke to would say, well, he's mad, isn't he? He has to be mad. That was the explanation everybody had for it, because that's the only explanation, plausible explanation people had. You couldn't do that unless you had lost your mind.
It's not normal behaviour, it is abnormal behaviour. It's not right, and it doesn't fit logically that in response to little Blue you had with the mother of the children, you go and kill the children. That's illogical and irrational.
After 19 days, the trial drew to a close, and jurors retired to deliberate on the case against Arthur Freeman.
The jury was deliberating for days and days and days, and we're all waiting, and it had been about 5 days, and they kept coming back and asking questions of the judge, and it was very clear they were very confused about what they had to decide. So after about 19 days of evidence, the jury was asked to go and deliberate and decide whether Arthur Freeman deliberately killed his child or was mad. The thing that was confusing them was that they didn't seem to get, if he's not mad, then he did murder his child. They thought there was other things in between.
Despite denying any memory of what he had done, Arthur Freeman accepted that he had caused Darcy's death. The jury had to decide if Arthur's actions were those of fluctuating madness or filicide.
They were to decide whether this man was mentally impaired or whether he committed murder. But it seemed that they thought they were two separate things. So if he wasn't mentally impaired, then they had to look at whether he'd committed murder. But it was actually very black and white. So they kept coming in and asking the judge, and the judge kept repeating it in a lot of legalese, which is their job. That's how they do it. And then they came in and told the courtroom that they were deadlocked and they couldn't make a decision. And there was women in that jury that were beside themselves. They were crying and looked very frustrated. And there was a lot of tension in that jury. You could see it. Because some people got it, others didn't, and it just wasn't working. And I just kept thinking to myself, what if they come back and find him not guilty?
Arthur Freeman never apologised for his actions or never explained why he did what he did. Often reluctant to appear in court, his trial was an examination of humanity. The jury had spent 5 days trying to understand why Darcy had died and was still no closer to a verdict. In 2011, Arthur Freeman stood in court charged with the murder of his 4-year-old daughter, Darcy. Over 19 days, the court heard evidence relating to Freeman's psychological state, and the jury was deadlocked in their decision of whether Freeman was mad or bad.
It's like a sense of dread, because you honestly don't know what's going to happen next.
He was just a mongrel and a scumbag, and that's why he was there, and there's no other reason.
The 37-year-old's barrister has argued that he was mentally impaired at the time.
It was about 7 o'clock, and usually jurors go home at 4:30. And the judge had said to them, "No, I think you can reach this decision. I would like you to stay back." And he said it out very clearly, and in a way dropped the legal jargon and just went, "If not this, then this." And they went back, and 40 minutes later they came back with a verdict.
After 19 days of challenging evidence and 5 days of tense and emotional deliberations, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty. Arthur Freeman was responsible for the murder of his daughter, Darcy.
I got in a cab and I burst into tears. Just a sense of relief. It was answered. The family had got their answer now. He was going to be punished for what he'd done. And I just cried. Just couldn't stop crying.
As the family welcomed the verdict, Darcy's mother, Peter Barnes, read her victim impact statement in court and spoke of the heartbreak of losing her daughter.
I think she only started to show how upset she was when she read her victim impact statement, but that was after he was found guilty.
Where to start is a challenge, as this statement brings to the surface all of the raw emotions I live with daily. The saying, "time heals all wounds," is not true for myself, and I don't ever expect it to be. Not a day goes by where I do not constantly think of Darcy, where I don't miss her and wish with all my heart that she was with me.
You're never going to get over it, but if you don't do something about it and move on, and that's why these things of expressing yourself in the victim impact statements are all good therapy, and it's good therapy for the people to get it off their chest.
No one can erase the thoughts and associated feelings I have of sitting in the hospital and having to tell the hospital staff that they were allowed to turn the life support machine off, of holding Darcy in my arms as she passed away and knowing that this decision would take her from me again, and knowing that there was no other option available to me.
The sentence was aired live on radio so the community could share in the moment.
The 2 local radio stations here decided to stream the audio of the sentence live. So people were driving around Melbourne listening to the sentence of Arthur Freeman. And I think the decision by the radio stations to do that was to give closure. And I think that was the right thing to do because people needed closure.
The jury rejected your defence of mental impairment, and once that defence was rejected, it was inevitable that you be convicted of murder. This was the killing of an innocent child. The circumstances of the killing were horrible. The throwing of your 4-year-old daughter from a bridge more than 80 metres above the ground could not be more horrible. It follows that you brought the broader community into this case in a way that's rarely, if ever, been seen before. It offends our collective conscience.
The big question in this case was, should he get a parole period? Which would mean that you get a life sentence, but then you would get the opportunity to apply to be released from prison after a certain period of time. It was given that he was going to get a life sentence for the murder of his daughter.
You'll be sentenced to be in prison for life. I fix a period of 32 years before you will be eligible for parole. It means that the earliest date you will qualify to be released will be the 29th of January 2041, when you will be 67 years of age.
That's a big whack of a sentence. We have double murderers in prison with lesser sentences than that.
Well, that particular judge was very good at the sentencing and So it obviously affected them as well as everyone else in the community, and I believe that what he said was great that he said it, and I just wish more judges would sort of do what that particular judge did.
He pointedly said a lot of people blame themselves, and then he very pointedly said, but you did this, you have to take responsibility for this. Because I can imagine all those people driving across the bridge that saw it. You know, do they replay it in their head? If I'd have rushed him, if I'd have got out sooner, if there would have been people that have passed that didn't stop at all.
Just goes to show how many victims there are in this case. Her death would have affected so many people, from her mother, her brothers, to Freeman's family, to Peter Barnes's extended family, to the people who witnessed what they did, to the emergency services people.
I'm told that some of those guys are still struggling today, because what I think you do is you try to make sense of something that just doesn't make any sense, and it's really hard to reconcile those two things.
With criminal proceedings completed, Arthur Freeman sought leave to appeal his sentence, a request that was unsuccessful. Questions raised in the court case by Darcy's mother, Peter Barnes, with regards to her doctors, were then addressed in a coronial inquest to explore if any lessons could be learned that might prevent similar deaths in the future.
Criminal proceedings were wound up in 2011, and it wasn't until all these years later that the State Coroner, the Victorian State Coroner, decided to hold an inquest into her death to examine the roles of health professionals in the lead-up. The focus was on Peter Barnes's meetings with her GPs in 2007 and 2008, and the concerns that she allayed to those doctors, whether those doctors acted responsibly in not reporting her concerns to authorities.
The inquest heard details that police had attended a domestic dispute between Arthur Freeman and Peter Barnes in 2007. After 7 years of marriage, Peter had expressed concerns for her children's welfare to her doctor at the time, after the police intervention.
She had reported, I think, an incident where Freeman came over to her house one day and there was a wrangle over trying to get Darcy's younger brother. So police were certainly aware that, you know, of instances of concern, and that was actually one of the reasons why the doctors didn't report or didn't disclose that information they were presented with to authorities, because they knew that the incidents had already been reported to the police. So they were comfortable, according to their statements, they were comfortable with not reporting it to authorities.
Satisfied that police had dealt with the details of the 2007 domestic dispute, doctors stated there were no emotional or physical indicators evident to them that Arthur Freeman was a threat to his children at the time.
One doctor said in a statement that even in hindsight, he just had no idea that Freeman would snap the way he did.
If they indicate to me, yeah, I had woke up this morning and decided this is what I'm going to do, and some do, it is a different issue, psychologically, I think. And it, in my opinion, intensifies the disturbance of the perpetrator if there is premeditation.
Those doctors never alerted authorities. The reason they didn't was because no one was able to really read Freeman's mood at the time. The Arthur Freeman they saw was always a man of a calm exterior, he was polite.
Family violence is a significant issue, and this is the really extreme end of it. So we'd love to be able to stop it, but it's one of those things that you can look back in hindsight and perhaps point to indicators. He was clearly upset, but the family law court stuff had been going on for some time. There was nothing to indicate that he was going to do what he's going to do.
In 2012, Peter Barnes took legal action against Vic Roads after they repeatedly ignored advice to install safety barriers prior to Darcy's death, a case that was settled out of court. The coronial inquest into Darcy's death recognised the installation of barriers on the West Cape Bridge 2 months after Darcy's death had a significant effect on the prevention of jumping suicides from the bridge.
There had been some other instances of people committing suicide on the Westgate Bridge. Since that time, there have been some barriers that have been erected, so people can no longer climb over or be thrown over the bridge.
The inquest findings place responsibility for Darcy's death solely with Arthur Freeman. His actions and Darcy's death were unable to have been predicted with any great certainty, and recommendations for the introduction of compulsory family violence training for doctors were made.
There's a new push now for doctors to have increased training and to have mandatory reporting. Probably safe to say there's been a renewed focus on family violence issues in Australia in recent years. The inquest into Darcy's death came amid this renewed focus.
Darcy Freeman's name has become synonymous with shock and sadness. A case now etched into the psyche of Melbourne. A timely reminder of the fragility of life. A tiny face of innocence that continues to evoke difficult memories for all involved.
Certainly a terrible tragedy. I'd certainly go so far as to say it's something that I'll never forget, nor will any of the people that attended there on the day, and it will never ever make any sense to me.
People still talk about the Arthur Freeman case, people still talk about Darcy being thrown from the bridge. You hear people in Melbourne talk about how they drive across the Westgate, and even though we have massive security guards there now, which came about after this crime, people still picture it in their heads.
It's one of those cases that still strikes a chord with people. You like to think your neighbours are people you can trust, and that your kids are safe at school, and that the driver in front of you won't pull over on a bridge and do something like that.
He's incarcerated for over 30 years. There are obviously some demons there, but he's got a lot of time to reflect and think about what he did.
Just 90 minutes drive southeast of Melbourne, Phillip Island, with its rugged beauty, is the perfect destination for a short break. But in August 2009, that tranquility was shattered when human remains began to wash up onto the shore.
Police are hoping missing person reports could shed some light on a gruesome find at Phillip Island.
The grisly discovery would stun a family.
There was a black and white photo of a tattoo and something about a leg being found, and I looked at it and I thought, what's that?
They say they're confident they're closing in on Rachel's killer, and quickly.
He asked her whether she'd like to come in and see a dissection.
The dark past of a killer would shine a light on the nation's justice system.
This guy is a master manipulator. He had people wrapped around his little fingers, and the system allowed him out to do this.
There is no such thing as closure for me, and there never will be. There never has been any sense of closure at all.
Revelations in court would uncover one of Australia's most evil killers.
God knows what he really did, or even definitely where he did it, because no DNA was recovered from the bathroom where she was supposed to have been cut up.
The murder of Rachel Betts was a crime that shook Australia. In August 2009, 27-year-old childcare worker Rachel Betts went missing from her home in Epping, a northern suburb of Melbourne. What happened to her would leave a family devastated and shine a light on the nation's criminal justice system.
At the start of Rachel's life, Rachel was an only child for about 11 years. I had her at a time when most of my friends didn't have children, so she was very popular with my friends. She was a real asset to the family all the time. She was great with her cousins, my nieces. She was the eldest of the 7 girls.
Rachel was a very loving girl. It's not unusual in a step-parenting situation where the children are not too happy about one of their parents having a new partner and vice versa, and possibly having step-siblings. And Rachel built bridges between my children and the younger 2 girls.
Rachel was really good at making friends with strangers pretty much on the spot. Anybody she wanted to meet, she would just march right up and do so, very bubbly and very good at making people feel welcome and like they were instantly the most important person around her. Just fun and lovable.
Although we lived together, sometimes we didn't see each other every day. I'd hear her get up in the morning. I always knew she was up and awake and getting ready because I could smell her toast and coffee.
She was always happy and bouncy. She was always happy to see you, happy to help. She was just one of those people who inspired you to be better. She was Rachel. You got a problem, you call her, she's there.
I could always call and talk to her if I was, say, having an argument at home or worried about school or my personal issues with friends or anything like that. She always made us feel that she would never judge us.
As she got older, she began to be interested in other things like education. She really wanted to be a teacher and a carer of children, which might have been influenced by babysitting us all the time.
Rachel had devoted her life to children. By the age of 27, she had a successful career as a childcare worker. But unfortunately, she wasn't able to have children of her own. In late 2008, she met 2 teenagers who were looking for a place to stay. Rachel's caring nature meant she was quick to welcome them into her home.
Rachel had met them through a friend of ours' neighbour, so they started to drop in and they were both having issues at home. So Rachel, being Rachel, went, any problems, you can always come here and stay here.
When Rachel took the girls in October 2008, November 2008, the second one, they really took over her life. And at first I thought that they were the source of the problems. The longer the girls were with her, the more she seemed run down, and I was sort of thinking, well, she's overworked and this is getting too much for her.
She was always stressed about money and being able to get by, basically being able to provide. Had 2 jobs and she lost one of them.
Faced with an ever-dwindling income, looking after the 2 girls was beginning to take its toll on Rachel and left her in an increasingly vulnerable situation. When an opportunity to make some extra money arose, Rachel was keen to take advantage.
Rachel had met a fellow, and this fellow had been working with an older man, and that older man had said to this guy that he was looking for young people to recruit to sell drugs, and for some reason this guy introduced Rachel to him, and as I understand it, came round and did a sell, Oh, look at you, you're trying to look after 2 kids and you're working so hard with 2 jobs and, you could have the girls through the day and run them around, and at night time you could go out to some nightclubs and pubs or whatever, and you can meet up with people, you can sell some drugs, you'll make a lot of money, your life will be easier, things will be better for you if you do this. How he managed to make that sell, I don't know, but she decided to give it a go. I guess she probably thought I could stop work for a while, see how it goes, you know. The problem with when you're moving with people who take those drugs, rather than just selling it, she was actually taking it. And it began to have quite a severe effect on her after a while.
Rachel began abusing crystal meth, or ice, an insidious drug that is ravaging parts of Australia. It began to take a terrible toll on Rachel, both physically and mentally, and her life began to spiral out of control.
We actually end up having, after living together for years, end up having a bit of an argument, and I moved out in March of 2009. I can honestly say she probably knew me better than anybody, and same for me with her, but by that time I couldn't tell you what she'd been up to for the day. Usually I could tell you what she ate for breakfast, lunch and dinner.
She started to develop some of these symptoms of paranoia, and it was obvious that something was wrong. She said there were all these people she didn't know were coming around, friends of the young girls were coming around, and she was feeling uncomfortable and unsafe. This paranoia thing that comes with taking these drugs was affecting her. She started becoming delusional. She had all kinds of strange experiences where she thought she was being watched or being followed. She was involved in a car accident where this car came through a red light and she thought that it had been set up and somehow deliberate. These sort of delusional ideas that do come with that particular drug, ice. Her teeth were very important to her. Smile was beautiful. And here she is taking this drug that is making her grind her teeth. And that really distressed me. I cried when I saw she had a baby's dummy by the bed to put between her teeth so that she wouldn't grind them and that she'd protect those front teeth. But my God, what is going on here? And I could see that there was this deterioration in her.
The final straw for her friends and family came when Rachel collapsed at her friend's home.
She went to hospital to be examined because they thought they may have been drugged and raped, so took her to the doctors to make sure everything was checked out, they were safe, blood tests. The crisis assessment team came because she wasn't well. Unfortunately, I think it was the drugs that got to her and made her paranoid.
They assessed her, took her to the hospital, got her into rehab to dry her out, and July she was back here with us, with her sisters and myself, and in a safe place.
Despite returning home, the temptations of her other life were proving too much for Rachel.
She had a party one night, a couple of friends round, and the girls were here and they had come out to stay for a couple of nights and they were getting noisy. The point is to keep her away from any drugs, and there wasn't supposed to be any drugs, so I asked them to leave. Anyway, Rachel took it as an opportunity to go and take the girls and go off to this other place that she had been organising for them to live at.
When she was leaving, she was distressed, and I was quite distressed too. She just felt, I think, stifled, living under her mother's roof again. I remember saying to her that you're being looked after here, that it had been a positive thing that she was here. But I think she felt guilty, and the last words she ever said to me in person were, "If I leave tonight, will you still love me tomorrow?" And I started to cry and said, "Of course I will." I felt like I had only just gotten my big sister back for the first time in quite a while. And to have her leave that night, I was filled with dread. I knew that nothing good could come of it.
What her family couldn't have known was that it would be the last time they would see Rachel alive.
Human remains have washed up on a beach southeast of Melbourne. The gruesome discovery was made by a man jogging along Ventnor Beach on Phillip Island.
In August 2009, the friends and family of Rachel Betts were becoming increasingly worried for her welfare. The 27-year-old childcare worker had, in the last few months, been involved with both drug abuse and dealing, and her loved ones were growing concerned.
I rang her up especially to say to her to please come home here to this house. I said to her, I'm really worried. You're not safe there. You're safe here. Please come home, I said. They were my last words to her. Please come home.
On the 18th of August, a new story broke about a grisly discovery at a popular tourist destination.
Police are hoping missing person reports could shed some light on a gruesome find at Phillip Island, a woman's tattooed left leg. The tattoo features red and violet flowers on a twisting vine.
The revelation about the tattooed leg set off alarm bells for Sandra. Holding on to the slender hope that her daughter was alive and well, she began frantically calling Rachel's friends.
I phoned Epping and asked the girls, where's Rachel? And have you heard from her? Have you spoken to her? And the youngest one lied to me and said, oh, yes, I heard from her about lunchtime and this isn't right. And so I said, put the other girl on the phone. And she said, oh, no, I haven't seen her for days and we've been calling and she's not answering. And this was just totally out of character. If Rachel was doing something, those girls would know exactly where she was going, exactly when she'd be back, how to contact her while she was away.
Rachel had disappeared and we didn't know where she was, and Sandra was getting very frantic. She'd started placing calls to friends and family and sent text out to everybody that she thought Rachel knew.
Her mother called me up one time and messaged me, so 12 at night time, midnight, and I've gone, who's messaging me at midnight? And I found out it was it was Sandra, Rachel's mum. Have you seen Rachel? So I called up and said, this is David. No, I haven't seen her for 2 months. She's supposed to be in rehab. And that's when she told me about the foot they found on the beach, where the tattoo was same as Rachel's. So there started, of course, the worry that Rachel may have died or something may have happened to her.
At the location of the grim discovery on Phillip Island, detectives were beginning to arrive at the beach that was now a crime scene.
I was afternoon on call on Sunday, the 16th of August 2009. I was contacted by Detective Sergeant Sean Audley, and he advised that a leg had been found at New Haven Beach, Phillip Island. It was a female leg, a full female leg. It had been severed around the hip joint. It appeared that I guess it would be a non-survivable incident that had occurred, so expected foul play pretty much straight away. There was a floral tattoo on the foot, and that gave us something at least to go and start checking our records to see if there were missing persons, firstly, and there's various databases of people with tattoos. They were looked at in the following days, and we weren't really getting anywhere with that. That came to nothing.
Rain got onto the computer and looked up some photos on Facebook, and she saw a photo of Rachel dancing barefoot, and it was definitely the left foot that had the tattoo on it. And that's when I phoned the police and said, look, I think that this is my daughter.
DNA testing conclusively proved Sandra's worst fears. The leg did indeed belong to her daughter. 3 weeks later, further remains were found on another beach, followed by reports of a right leg sighted by the crew of a ferry. Tragically, the rest of Rachel's body was never recovered. Now they had identified the victim, police began to investigate Rachel's background for clues as to what had led to her tragic death. It wasn't long until her associations with the world of illegal drugs came to light.
She was working in childcare till about end of 2008, and after that point in time, 2009, it appears that that's when the drug dealing took off.
Rachel had been given the impression that she could make easy money quickly. It meant for Rachel that she could get that bigger house, have that money for the rent and bond to move herself, the girls, they'd have their own room. It wasn't for a lavish lifestyle, it was so that Rachel felt that she could provide for them. It just didn't work out that way for her.
Rachel's mother, Sandra, was aware that her daughter was mixing with nefarious characters, and one name in particular was causing her great concern. 54-year-old parolee, John Leslie Kums.
I had conversations with her about John Kums and said, this man sounds really wrong to me. And she said, well, he's got a criminal history. I said, well, you've got to avoid this person. This is not good.
A search of Rachel's home in Epping was also making detectives suspicious about John Kums.
There were various diaries that mentioned various people that she knew, lots of phone numbers. Also, some drug dealing type of equations were in these things as well. There's a reference to being scared of a JC, whom we believe to be John Kums. But the more digging we did, I suppose speaking to friends of Rachel, we realised that John Kums was her boss in relation to drug dealing. And we also spoke to one person who said that Rachel told them that she was going fishing with her boss, and she was looking forward to it. Going fishing seemed to be code for going away and dealing in drugs or drug type of trip. And those closest to her knew that's what the terminology meant. And we also go through the list of names of people that she knew, and obviously John Kums stood out because of his prior criminal history. Rachel's family, they knew obviously how close Rachel was with these girls in her care, and they found it very hard to believe that these girls didn't know where Rachel had gone on that Tuesday evening. These girls were very fearful. They were told by Rachel that she was gone and she'd be on a fishing trip, or 48 hours at the latest sort of thing. So after that period of time, they became increasingly concerned. They did know that she went away with John Kums, but they were terrified to speak with us about it. They thought the best course of action was to keep it to themselves. I think they got a bit of an idea that we were on the right track with Mr. Kums anyway. I dealt with the two girls fairly regularly over that first 2 months. I ended up taking about half a dozen statements from the youngest one, who was probably closest to Rachel. And she took a while to warm to us as well, because all she'd really known, I suppose, was she'd seen Rachel drug trafficking, and I guess police were the enemy if you're out there drug trafficking. And after a while, she decided that it was okay to divulge what she did know, and she knew a lot.
With the help of the young girl, detectives were able to trace Rachel's last movements. On the 10th of August, 6 days before her remains were found, Rachel drove the 20 minutes from Epping to Heidelberg, where she left her car, and was allegedly picked up at some nearby shops by John Kums. The last time anyone was in contact with Rachel was 6:30 that night, when she spoke to her friend Deanne on the phone. The call betrayed none of the imminent danger Rachel was in.
She'd said to me she was going fishing. She'd be back, and I said, well, because we'd planned to meet up on the Monday. And she said, no, oh, you're fine, I'll be back. And I said, seemed happy and to be doing whatever maybe she was doing. It sounded to me like she was jumping in a car. She didn't seem scared. To my understanding, when Rachel was talking, she was happy about wherever she was going. So at no point did she sound threatened or anything like that. I don't believe Rachel thought that she wasn't coming back.
When questioned by police, Kums provided a seemingly solid alibi to explain his movements at the time of Rachel's disappearance. His associates corroborated his story. However, using mobile phone tracking and other techniques, detectives were quick to cast doubt on his version of events. As their suspicions grew, and in order to establish the facts, the decision was made to arrest John Kums. Also arrested were his associates, Kums' 54-year-old partner Maureen Renwick, another acquaintance Nicole Godfrey, and friend Ryan Buscema.
We believe we had sufficient evidence to arrest him and to charge him with the murder of Rachel Betts, but also the other people that we arrested at the time too, as in Maureen Renwick, Ryan Buscema and Nicole Godfrey. So it was a coordinated arrest of all of those people to get their version of events at the same time. So once we arrested him, we placed him in the vehicle, and Lee Smith said to him the hardest part, saying it. And he said, "Yeah, I know. She pushed my buttons," and he said, "I killed her. She made me fucking angry. She taunted me." That's what he said.
Police now had Rachel's alleged killer in custody. They now had to determine exactly what had happened to her. With the suspected murderer of Rachel Betts in custody, the dark, chilling past of John Leslie Kums began to emerge. In the first of a series of interviews with the alleged killer, the detective's first task was to try and establish from Kums exactly how Rachel had met her tragic and untimely death.
No one really knows exactly what happened to Rachel. We've got Mr. Kums' version of events as to when I interviewed him. He said that they drove down there together to Phillip Island, to 3 Terry Crescent, Wimbledon Heights, Nicole Godfrey's house, and that they arrived there after midnight, and that Nicole Godfrey had a cup of coffee or a cup of tea with the two of them. Mr. Kums says that after they had their coffee or whatever, Rachel went and lay in one of the rooms on the bed.
Detectives were stunned when, in an effort to explain what had happened to her, Kums claimed that Rachel was implicated in the abuse of the 2 girls she was caring for.
Mr. Kums claimed that Rachel let him know that she'd allowed for the girls to be sexually assaulted, and that she made money out of it because the girls got to pay her debts. And Kums claimed that infuriated him, and he decided to put her in a sleeper hold and strangle her. I said, well, how did you do it? And he showed with arm movements as to what he did in relation to strangling Rachel.
Kums went on to describe how he mutilated Rachel's body.
He said that she deserved to die, didn't deserve to go to leave this earth as a woman. So he says he's stabbed her repeatedly in the breast region, and I believe that was after she'd died. You had to look at it as if this was a side of beef. That's how he kind of described it. It was something where the life had gone. It's a piece of meat that he had to just make the cuts, separate the joints, and treat it like that. That's how he referred to it. He did that when I interviewed him. He explained it that way, and he also explained it the same way to Maureen Renwick in a prison phone call. He said they had to make something bigger, smaller. Pretty horrendous.
Another chilling version of events came from Nicole Godfrey, Kums' acquaintance, who was present in the house on the supposed night of Rachel's murder.
She talked about limbs popping and things like that she could hear, and that at one stage he asked her whether she'd like to come in and see a dissection. So she was certainly present whilst this was going on in her bathroom, and it was quite a small 3-bedroom house down there.
Despite the detail and the description, detectives questioned the veracity of Kums' version of events.
At one point, he did talk to Maureen on the phone about it, and he said something about the manner of death, and it was like one click. It was the cleanest kill ever. So you hear that and you say to yourself, well, what is that then? Is that a strangulation? Is that breaking of the neck, or what is that? You know, it could be I don't know.
In my mind, I saw him cutting out her tattoos on her abdomen. He also cut her breasts off. And again, we've got all kinds of stories. Oh, he used 5 different knives. Oh no, he used a box cutter that you keep cutting the thing.
It's hard to believe a word that comes out of Mr. Kums' mouth. It's very difficult to know when it was that she was actually killed. There was no forensic evidence, but they did clean with bleach-based cleaning products.
God knows what he really did, or even definitely where he did it, because no DNA was recovered from the bathroom where she was supposed to have been cut up.
It came as no surprise to Sandra Betts when John Leslie Kums was charged with her daughter's murder in November 2009.
When the police asked us who did we think it would likely to be, we said John Kums, because we knew he had some kind of criminal history. And at the time, that was all I knew. I now know a great deal more about him.
There was a lot of police reports, a lot of coronial reports that we had to go through to look at Kums' past, and it's a very dark past. We were told that Kums had 2 previous convictions, and 2 major previous convictions where he'd killed 2 people.
He killed a fellow by the name of Michael Sperani in February 1984.
Michael Sperani lived in the seaside town of Mount Martha. In 1984, he was selling his car, and his potential purchaser was one John Leslie Kums. On the pretense of confirming whether the car could tow a boat, Kums hitched up a trailer and then offered Michael the chance to accompany him on a trip out to sea.
John Kums enticed Michael Sperani to come out for a ride on the boat.
It transpired that Sperani was dating one of Kums' friends, a relationship that his friend disapproved of. Kums seemingly had thought of a solution to this problem.
It appears he was assaulted on the boat, and then he was stabbed by Kums. He was thrown out into the water, and Kums then ran over him with the boat's propeller, and then after a while went up to him and pulled him up slightly, and then stabbed him some more. And Kums made a comment to his wife at the time, when he later relayed what happened, and said that he stabbed him a little bit so the fish could finish him off.
"44-year-old Henry Desmond Kells was asleep in his Edith Vale home when he was attacked in the early hours of the 17th of November, 1984.
Another good friend of his by the name of Opie, it appears that Kells was socialising with Opie's landlady, and this upset Opie, and Opie complained to Kums about it, and Kums thought he'd go and fix that problem as well.
Broke into the bungalow knowing he would be asleep and drunk, and attacked him in a really vicious way. He pinned him down. There were bruises on Kells' feet and knees.
There's evidence that he's punching and that sort of thing, and then Kums went to the kitchen, got a knife, and stabbed him and killed him, and also mutilated his genitalia. We believe it's probably to try and give the impression that there'd been some sort of sexual transgression and maybe revenge had taken place, something like that, which seems to be another theme with Mr. Kums as well. He seems to blame sexual misbehaviour, or he alleges sexual misbehaviour on behalf of victims, and he did that on that occasion with Sperani, and I believe he was probably trying to give the same impression in relation to what happened with Desmond Kells as well.
In 1985, Kums was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Henry Desmond Kells. He was granted an 11-year minimum term on appeal. At his parole hearing, the board was told that Kums did not pose a substantial threat to the community. What they weren't aware of, though, was that he had murdered Michael Sperani 8 months before killing Kells, and had got away with it. Satisfied he was safe to release, Kums left prison in October 1996. Within 3 months of being paroled, Kums was arrested again and convicted of Sperani's murder. Despite being now responsible for the deaths of 2 men, but supposedly rehabilitated, he was handed a minimum term of just 10 years. By 2007, Kums was released on parole back into the community, where he started a relationship with Maureen Renwick and began dealing drugs. Just 2 years after his release, while still on parole, Rachel would be dead.
And he did try and present as the jovial, grandfatherly type figure. He was quite cunning and devious the way he operated.
To look at him, you wouldn't think he was dangerous to that extent. I'd met him twice. My first reaction to him was, well, why are you hanging out with someone that's that age?
This guy is a master manipulator. He had people wrapped around his little fingers, and he cultivated a facade. There was this nice, jolly, plump guy who would never harm a fly.
While Rachel's loved ones tried to comprehend Kums' dangerous past and began to ask questions of a justice system that let a killer out onto the streets not once, but twice, detectives were preparing to go to trial. In 2011, John Leslie Kums was about to appear in court, charged with the murder of Rachel Betts. For his victim's family, the trauma and devastation of the past 2 years was about to be played out in public.
John Leslie Kums will face the Melbourne Magistrates Court for allegedly strangling the 27-year-old and throwing her off a pier on Phillip Island.
First, you have the committal in the Magistrates Court, where they test to see whether the proceedings will be successful in the Supreme Court. It means that Kums was able to introduce things in the Magistrates Court, claims about Rachel which were untrue.
The committal process, the media report all the things that are a bit sensational and made Rachel look to be a drug-using, drug-selling woman. The worst parts, I suppose, that came out from the witnesses, that was what was reported.
He claimed that Rachel had set these girls up for sex acts, for money and all this rubbish, and the girls were interviewed in the court and they said, no, that didn't happen, Rachel would never do that to us, etc. But he did succeed in besmirching her name, which was what he wanted to do. He got this rubbish into the press.
He said that Rachel said that if he played his cards right, she could have his way with the little one, as in the young girl, the younger of the 2 girls. When I interviewed about that and told him that he didn't say that previously to me, he goes, oh, I did. Well, he didn't. We went back and checked the transcripts from the interview and he never did.
To me, it was just another excuse to paint what he'd done in a better light, like as if he was doing society a favour by what he'd done.
I don't believe that she exposed those girls to or encouraged any sort of interference of them, or allowed it to happen. There's no evidence at all to suggest that, apart from what comes out of Kums' mouth, which cannot be believed at all.
Little could prepare Rachel's family for the emotional torment of being exposed to the baseless allegations about their sister, peddled by John Kums.
We had to put up with a lot of lies being told about Rachel in the media, and we weren't really allowed to say anything back or do anything back, which was very hard for a long time.
I never realised how much the journalists themselves are able to pick and choose interesting or sort of headline-grabbing elements of any given case and put it together in their own way. Because the way that cases like these are portrayed to the public have a really quite a large influence on how the public then see the victim or see the perpetrator.
The way victims and their relatives are treated in court was a shock to the Betts family, and something they have been inspired to try and change.
That's an issue I'm raising at the moment, along with the issue of having your own barrister in court to represent the victim's interests specifically as a third party. And I think that that's something that happens in a lot of countries around the world. and it needs to be looked at here. We need the pendulum to shift a bit the other way. At the moment, the victim doesn't have equal rights to the accused, and the right to counsel, I think, is a very important one.
After the committal, we were booked off for trial, so organised all the witnesses, and then on day one of the trial, he decided to plead guilty.
On the 26th of August 2011, John Leslie Kums was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility for parole for the murder of Rachel Betts. The judge ordered that his sentence would be served cumulatively with his existing term for the Sperani murder. In passing sentence, the judge described Kums as someone with a frightening predilection for murder.
I think the thing that stuck out the most was on the day of sentencing, when he was in court and they read out the sentence and he was being led from the dock out the side door, and he gave the finger up, known as the bird, to the courtroom on the way out, as if to say, well, I don't really care.
He stuck his finger up at him. Like, screw you, I killed your daughter and I'm still alive. Like, he's a monster who doesn't deserve to be alive.
It's really hard to say what justice is, isn't it? We got the best outcome that could be created in the circumstances. We got a judge who saw through all the lies and the stories and the accusations that Kums made, and who saw that this is a person who had to get a life sentence with no minimum, and he really saw it clearly for what it was, because he didn't make them concurrent. He made consecutive life sentences. It will be life followed by life, and no minimum set.
As a way of coping with the loss of her daughter, Sandra Betts has fought for a more rigorous examination of the parole system, something that is a cornerstone of the Australian legal process.
Parole is a system that enables the gradual supervised release of people from prison into the community. So typically when someone is sentenced to a term of imprisonment, they will get a minimum sentence and a maximum sentence. And what determines when they're released after serving that minimum sentence is a decision by the parole authority, the parole board, and they have to decide, is it appropriate for that person to be released?
Well, the parole system was so broken. Kums was recommended for parole on the basis that he was assessed as a low risk, a double murderer. I wouldn't have thought that that could be possible given the sentence he had. But because he was assessed as low risk and the parole board didn't question this, he was assigned to a junior corrections person. He wasn't monitored very much. So there weren't the checks, the cross-checking on what he's saying is true or not true, and what he's doing is what he says he's doing, what accommodation is the appropriate accommodation.
What we have seen in Victoria most recently is some very serious failures that have shone a light on the parole system, and that's been a good thing. It shouldn't have taken those horrific crimes for this kind of reform to happen. There's been a substantial increase in the parole board's budget. There's been improvements in the quality of information that is being presented to the parole board to enable it to make proper decisions around managing the risk to the community. We saw something like 10,000 decisions being made every year with only a few minutes for the parole board to consider each one of those decisions. When you consider the potential risks involved and the importance around those decisions, it really was an unsustainable practice that we had. That's now changing, and that's a positive thing.
The death of Rachel Betts and other high-profile murders has made the Australian justice system question itself and its processes. But despite the improvements that have and continue to be made, it is little comfort for Rachel's friends and family, who still have to live their lives without her.
The grief that comes with the sort of experience where your daughter is murdered is really intense and invasive, and it pervades daily life. Most mornings I will wake up with some thoughts of Rachel, and it's 6 years down the track. And there's always the important times that her birthday, she'd be 33 now. It's awful. And I know it's not just me that's affected, my children have been very affected.
I miss my confidant. I miss the support, the unconditional support. I was looking forward to her teaching me how to drive and being there when I graduated high school. I have a sense of what she's lost as well, though, is what I've lost. I've lost my sister, my hero, but she's lost the potential of a full life.
It makes me really both angry and sad that she didn't get to see me become an adult myself, and then to be able to have that relationship with her on a different level, and like every new step I take in life, she doesn't get to know about that or to see that. And you see me become someone that we probably could have been even closer now than we were before. And I'm also kind of irrationally scared of overtaking her age. To become older than my older sister is really strange but scary to me.
I dread time moving forward. I remember dates and numbers, anniversaries, and I feel more hopeless and frustrated that every year goes by is another year further away from what happened.